Introduction to the Eagle in the Valley of Ice and Fire. Song of Ice and Fire, Power Tour, is a fan work. If Prime Minister Jon Eileen had his eldest son, if the valley was no longer fully transparent, and if reason and power returned to the Eileen family, what would happen to Westeros? 1. Atis Erin, Born of Thunder. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The dejected atmosphere permeated the entire valley. The mountain clan, which had been dormant for several years, never took half a step out of the Mingyue Mountains without permission under the supervision of the guardian Jon Eileen in the eastern region. Now, the valley transportation route from Eagle's Nest City to Junlin has seen countless mountain savage attacks like wild grass. Many foreign women who came to the valley to marry with the nobles within their jurisdiction, participated in martial arts competitions and banquets, were abducted, and many businesses with the Hajin region, which heavily relied on land transportation, were looted and bankrupted. Jon Eileen, dressed in armor, rode on a fine horse that was a specialty of the valley, with 100 elite cavalry behind him. The Blue Moon Eagle flag of the Eileen family stands proudly in front of the team. He looked helplessly at the High Mountain clan soldiers retreating into the valley. Months of vigilance and patrols had no effect on these barbarians who were familiar with the terrain of the valley. Even during this period, many weapons and equipment were given to the enemy in vain. And his second wife, who was also his niece, became pregnant. Jon Eileen didn't want to waste time on the wild anymore, so he looked ahead seriously. A row of steel spears stood in front of the horse, and Jon Eileen looked at the dozens of High Mountain clans behind him. With a long sword, he pointed and said, "Cavalry formation, charge." Thick smoke suddenly billowed on the mountain road, and if someone passed by the side of the road at this moment, the roar caused by the hooves hitting the ground would surely resound in both ears, and the earth seemed to be shaking. The Gaoshan clan showed no signs of weakness, bared their teeth and let out a roar of resentment. They used miscellaneous army-like equipment to form a fragile defense line, staring intently at the charging valley cavalry. The steel spear was handed out, and the ground was stained with blood. The flesh and blood of the soldiers of the Gaoshan clan flew wildly, and the outcome of the war was predetermined at the moment of contact. The Duke of the Valley scanned the battlefield, turned his horse's head, and ran towards the highest peak of the Mingyue Mountains. The giant spear. And the cavalry in the valley formed several small teams again, slowly advancing towards both sides of the mountain road, and they needed to continue patrolling. When the residents of the valley at the foot of the mountain looked up at the giant spear soaring into the sky, they habitually heard the long howls of eagles in their minds, seemingly subconsciously seeing the distant giant spear as the habitat of the giant eagle, the lucky land of the 7 gods. The magnificent Eagle Nest City spans across the giant spear and sits at the top of the Mingyue mountain range. Every proud canyon knight boasting in their tavern must bring their experience of standing on the highest tower of Eagle's Nest, the Virgo Tower, overlooking the entire Eileen Valley. Therefore, every time you enter a narrow Eileen Valley tavern, you can encounter more than 5 people with the same experience. Perhaps the number of valley people you encounter while wandering around the canyon is limited to this number. Under the Eagle Nest Castle, there is always rainfall, but it seems to have little impact on the castle. The airflow from the narrow sea flows westward along the Eileen Valley, and when encountering the barrier of the Mingyue mountain range, there is always rainfall along the way. This is a common weather for valley people living in the long summer, but today is an exception. The strong wind caressed the walls of Eagle's Nest City, and the pendulum of the New Moon Hall swayed like a drunkard, with rainwater even overflowing the halls where guests stayed. "Oh no, it's all water here." A thunderous cry echoed through the entire New Moon Hall, like a person's voice. A man wrapped in a large raincoat walked in at the entrance of the hall, looking desperately at the floor covered in rainwater. He walked up to the table closest to him, took out a few copper coins, and threw them at the sparkling white slate table as if venting his frustration. "Give me some wine quickly, it's you." His eyes stared like copper bells, his gaze fixed on the busy running boy beside him. Upon hearing this, the runner quickly put down the bowl of water in his hand and ran towards the back hall. Before running, the man was taking off his raincoat, and the black-crowned stag inside his clothes caught the eye. He suddenly realized that he had encountered a big shot. "Don't scare him, Robert." The companion who remained silent next to the man finally spoke, looking seriously at Robert beside him. Robert revealed his well-groomed face, raised his eyebrows and grinned. "Oh ho, the cold northern wolf, Lord Edstack, finally spoke up all the way, ahaha." The hearty laughter instantly attracted all the passengers at the New Moon Hall. Many people were worried about when the rainy day would end. When they heard the noise, they naturally became angry, but they looked over at the source of the sound and saw who was instantly deflating. Ed felt the gaze around him and involuntarily pursed his lips. He frowned and whispered to Robert, "Pay attention to etiquette, Robert. This is the place where Lord Eileen hosts his guests." Robert pretended to look around and said, "If Fushi Fortress uses this poor and dilapidated place as a place to entertain guests, outsiders might think that Byrasian owes the Iron Vault millions of gold dragons ha." He leaned his head close to Ed and chuckled in a low voice. Ed reluctantly took the wine brought by the waiter and thanked him softly. Looking at Robert, who was enjoying his drink, he couldn't help but worry. "I heard from the scholar that Mrs. Eileen should give birth today, this weather." Before he could finish speaking, in an instant, a beam of lightning almost pressed against the giant's gun and attacked the bottom of the canyon. The clouds were suddenly disturbed by thunder in mid-air, as if the entire sky in the valley was also shaking. Ed's expression was momentarily stunned, and Robert, who had just closed his eyes and drank heavily, felt a beam of blue light flashing through the darkness. He was about to ask, "Boom boom." The thunderous sound that echoed through the entire valley echoed through the gun of giants, causing the 7 gods' cultivators in the hall to quickly close their eyes and pray. The young runner couldn't resist the temptation of this spectacle and threw away his work to sneak to the window to look around. The passengers were also amazed by the spectacle they had just encountered. Only Robert was at a loss and grabbed Ed to ask, but Ed only pointed to the one that was blown away by the thunder in the distance. In the clouds, a ray of sunlight poured into Eagle's Nest City through the cracks in the clouds, and the continuous heavy rain gradually subsided as the sunlight gradually entered. In the distant moon tower, a cry of a baby entered everyone's ears like a spring song from a wandering poet. The scholar walked up to the old duke holding the baby and said, "It's a boy, sir." Jon Eileen carefully took the baby from the bachelor's arms, tears in his eyes, and his smile could hardly be hidden under the duke's disguise, all piled up on Jon's face. He excitedly looked at Mrs. Eileen, his wife, and niece lying on the delivery bed with weak breath. "Luyuna, we have a son." At this moment, Mrs. Eileen could only reluctantly respond with a smile. The maidservants entered and exited, and dozens of ravens were released by the scholars from their nests, informing the feudal lords of the valley and the 7 kingdoms. Duke of Eagle's Nest, Guardian of the Canyon, and Guardian of the Eastern Territory, Lord Jon Eileen, of his new son, who will be the heir of the valley. The sunlight completely permeated the sky above the Mingyue mountain range, and Jon's 2 adopted sons, Robert Byrasian from the Stormland and Ed Starksanson from the north, rushed to the hall of Eagle's Nest City. You could vaguely hear the sound of Alicia's tears waterfall and the gradual whistling of eagles in the distance, leaving only the natural sound of the valley behind. "Jon, where did you hide me and Ned's brother?" Robert looked up at Jon Eileen as soon as he stepped into the hall. Then they bowed to the old duke together with Ed. "Your brother is crying and making a scene in the maid's arms." Lord Eileen was obviously happy, and the corners of his mouth kept rising as he mentioned his son. "Adult, you finally have a child, huh?" Robert's inappropriate laughter reappeared, and Ed quickly took over Jon's conversation as he saw his gradually darkened face. "From now on, the valley has its own young master." "Congratulations, sir." Upon hearing these words, Jon's expression softened. "All right, when the customs and taxation in Haiyu Town are over, I will hold a grand martial arts competition in the valley to celebrate my son's naming. At that time, I will invite the royal family and nobles, as well as the Baratheon and Stark families, to welcome me." The old duke made a rare gesture and waved his fist fiercely. Not only that, but also free riders from all walks of life, minstrels, mercenaries from Slave Bay, magicians, Red Saints of Mirren, bravest theater troupe, and prostitutes from Reese all have to be invited over. Ha ha ha, celebrate my own brother's name together. Robert pondered and his eyes gradually brightened. I just hope this newly born eagle from Eileen Valley doesn't look like my brother, damn the 7 gods. Ed couldn't bear to continue listening and advised the old duke directly, Robert's plan is too costly and absolutely unacceptable. Before Jon could speak, Robert angrily said to Ed, 7 gods hell. Ned, this is a joyful thing. Can you bear to see our beloved Lord Aaron's eldest son see such a shabby martial arts competition on his naming day? What's the cost? Bring the golden dragon from Seagull Town, clean up the damn Lannister's mine, and at best, invite some officials from the Iron Treasury to come and serve them well, borrowing as much as you can. Just as Ed rebutted, Robert continued his conversation, not to mention Byrasian and the Stark family. It's not that there's no free money, ha ha ha. This directly angered the old duke. Enough, Robert, can you keep fooling around for a lifetime? Seeing the serious expression on the old duke's face, Robert felt very bored and closed his mouth. Ed saw Robert's silence and asked, Sir, has the young master's name been decided yet? The old duke smiled and looked at Ed. I plan to name him on the day of the martial arts competition. As for the name. The old duke walked down from the high position in the hall. The king's throne of the valley carved in fishbeam wood was revealed behind him. The old duke looked out of the narrow arched window into the azure sky, and the sound of eagle whistles came from afar. I already have the answer in my heart, the old duke said slowly. The flying eagle knight of the Eileen family, born of thunder, is Atis Eileen. The old duke thought to himself. He seemed to have seen the scene of his son's name being announced and everyone cheering on the high platform of the martial arts competition in the Moon Gate Castle. 2. Servants of Fushi City. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Wyma, raise your arm. Coach Samuel Sherdong corrected Wyma's bow-holding motion. Wyma furrowed her brow and tried hard to raise her arm, despite the intense pain. With a swish, an arrow slashed through the air above the grassland and hit the distant bullseye steadily. Wyma saw the arrow she had not yet shot and turned her head in confusion, searching for the source of the arrow. As soon as he turned his head, he saw the person he least wanted to see at this moment. You're bothering me to practice archery, Atis. With a mournful expression, his tone was also so low. Good day, Sir Wilmar Royce. Atticus Eileen made a face at him and turned to run towards the forest. Damn it. Wyma originally planned to curse a few words before continuing his training, but Atis's voice in the distance instantly caught his attention. Follow me, Wyma, I found a treasure inside. Wyma looked up at the instructor. Don't, you know the Count won't allow it. Sam said sternly. Wyma immediately stood up, picked up his sword, and ran away. Goodbye, Lord Sherdong. At the moment when he turned his head and ran away, the wind blew happily in his ear, leaving only the voice of the illegitimate son of Rune City scolding behind him. At that time, he felt extremely happy. Fushi City is located on the south bank of a narrow fjord deep into the valley, with moist water vapor permeating the entire castle area. Together with Haiyu Town to the south, it forms a fortress and city, guarding the flat land that does not occupy the majority of the valley. Unlike the towers of Eagle Nest City, it is a rare pleasure to see from afar from the towers of Runcher City. Not far away is the endless sea, and the wind of the Virgin Tower of Eagle Nest City can overturn teenagers. Wyma followed behind Atis panting heavily. Atis's stamina is always enviable, Wyma thought to herself. Atis swiftly flipped over like a shadow bobcat, leaping over the complex branches and vines in the forest. The cloak on his shoulders, which had previously been imprinted with the emblem of the Valley Eagle, was nowhere to be seen. His lightweight leather armor wrapped around his slender figure, weaving through the green forest curtains, appearing particularly energetic. After an unknown amount of time, the surroundings were completely covered with thick trees and vines, and the wild atmosphere was already covered by the damp heat of the jungle. Atis finally stopped in front. Did we go too far? Waima looked around anxiously, but when he saw the scene before him, he couldn't help but freeze. The trees in front were all broken, with exceptionally flat sections that seemed to be cut by extremely sharp swords, making them appear particularly open and unnatural in the dense forest. The 7 gods are above. Waima widened her eyes in shock and murmured in her mouth. Atis pointed to the other side and whispered, "Shoo, it's still there." Waima looked in the direction of his fingers, and a small shadow bobcat was lying on a nearby branch, hiding itself with the help of leaves, looking fiercely at them. "Atis, why don't you call the instructor over? It's too risky." Waima rubbed his slightly twitching face, knowing that the bobcat was too thin, but he was also afraid of its sharp claws, especially when he saw the miserable situation of the trees ahead. "Come on, Waima, you don't really like these things." Atis cautiously drew out his sword. "Is it a ghostly spirit?" He tiptoed slowly towards the direction of the bobcat. Waima indeed yearns for the Great Wall. He often says that he will join the night watch of the Great Wall when he is 18 years old, enter the ghost forest outside the Great Wall, and search for the ancient spirits and monsters that threaten the kingdom. But he is not yet 14. Waima suppressed her inner fear, drew out her sword, and slowly followed Atis. Because of her daze just now, Atis in front had been blocked by trees and disappeared from her sight. Even worse, the shadow of the mountain cat on the tree disappeared. "Atis." Waima called out softly, daring only to whisper softly. When he gathered the courage to circle behind the tree, he froze. The thin and small shadow bobcat was affectionately lying in Atis's arms, while Atis was feeding the bobcat meat brought from Seagull Town. What? Waima couldn't understand the situation again. Although this situation often occurred during his time with Atis, there was no such dangerous situation as it is now. Waima looked at the coquettish bobcat in front of her and thought in disbelief. "Waima, it's called Adam." Atis raised his hands and raised the face of the bobcat in front of Waima. Waima quickly took a few steps back, and his sword couldn't help but rise high. "Hey! Don't scare the cat." Atis picked it up and said, "I was practicing horseback archery with your father, Lord Royce. I left him behind and found Adam in the jungle. He's so young, it's truly rare. This small shadow bobcat can't live for 3 days in the valley," Waima said disdainfully, thinking to herself that her father had not yet trained me in horseback riding and archery. "So it was destined for me to keep it," Atis said nonchalantly, smiling as he placed the bobcat on the tree. Adam usually lives in the crevice in front of him, which is easy to defend but difficult to attack, and difficult for other fierce animals to approach. Smart cat. Adam silently navigated through the trees and exposed rock layers in the distance, disappearing from their sight in the blink of an eye. Atis and Waima walked back along the footsteps of their arrival, and the sound of military horns in the distance had already sounded multiple times. Waima looked at Atis's dirty face and sometimes couldn't be sure if he was the eldest son of Lord Eileen, who would inherit the entire valley in the future. Thinking of this, Waima looked a bit dejected as she turned her face away. Although she knew she couldn't help but be scolded by her father today, she didn't complain about it. The desolation of her childhood identity was real. "Waima, do you know I've been hunting with Sam lately?" Atis's voice rang in his ear. "I know," Waima responded impatiently, having to admit that Atis's knightly talent was the highest among all his peers, whether it was swordsmanship, spears, archery, or horseback riding. "I caught many flocks of geese, and I learned some skills from the nuns in the church to make their feathers into this for you." Atis took out a ring feather headdress from his armor's arrow pocket. "It can be hung on his head." Waima took over the slightly rough headdress in his aesthetics and pursed his lips. This is quite ugly. His shoulders involuntarily shrugged together, his eyes trying not to look at Atis's face, the face of the valley darling, inheriting the beauty of his mother Mrs. Eileen, even though he could vaguely see his future heroism at the age of only 12. Atis saw this scene and smiled, saying, "Dude, did you forget that next week is your naming day?" He then punched him in the chest. Waima lowered her head and pursed her lips, smiling as she pushed Atis with both hands. The two of them struggled all the way out of the forest. At the moment Waima walked out of the forest, his father's tall and thin figure immediately occupied his sight. He swallowed his saliva and thought to himself that something was wrong. But Sir John Royce did not approach him, but only shouted to Atis beside him, "Atis, your father wants you to go to the throne immediately." "Why?" Waima even asked before Atis, who was also puzzled as Atis stared at John Royce. Since the 9-year-old Atis left Eagle's Nest and arrived at the Royce family's stronghold, Talisman, Atis has rarely met the Prime Minister's father, who was far away from King's Landing, and his stepmother, Lysothuli, who also went to King's Landing. In Atis's vague memory, his stepmother gradually developed mental problems after constantly giving birth to dead babies. At first, she was polite to him, but gradually she often looked at him with a jealous gaze from behind. Even during his years as a servant of Lord Yuan in Rune City, whenever he fell asleep at night, he often woke up from dreams of the abnormal gaze in Lysothuli's eyes. "I heard you have a younger brother, Atis," replied John Royce expressionlessly. "Perhaps it won't be too late for me to leave after Weimer's 14th birthday next week, Lord Royce," Atis pleaded softly instead of immediately agreeing. "This is the Prime Minister's order, Atis." John looked deeply at Waima, but the gifts of Rune City and the manpower and supplies to escort the heirs of Eagle Nest City need to be prepared. Waima looked up at her father incredulously, her eyes glowing. "I will convey the opinions of the valley heirs to the Prime Minister," said Jon Royce, and left on horseback. Atis and Waima smiled at each other, rode on the horse handed over by the servant, and followed closely behind, heading towards the direction of Rune City. Atis returned to his room, took off his sweaty clothes, stuffed his body into a wooden bucket filled with hot water, and immersed his whole body in the comfortable water temperature. He leaned his head against the edge of the bucket, his eyes fixed on the milky white ceiling, and reflected on what Sir Royce had said. "I will convey the opinions of the valley heirs to the Prime Minister." "The heir of the valley, Your Excellency, Prime Minister." Atis felt an itch in his heart. Such an unfamiliar title came from Sir Royce's mouth. He couldn't help but think of what kind of expression this Royce would have if he had seen him all day calling him Lord of Rune or Lord of Bronze. After taking a hot bath, Atis was wearing velvet pajamas and half lying in bed, recalling the last heartfelt conversation with his father. At that time, Atis was heartbroken by the death of his hunting dog that had accompanied him for many years. He locked himself inside and refused to see anyone. However, he could only prevent his father from coming in. He remembered his father softly calling his name outside the door, "Atis, Atis, I brought some honey and candy you like to eat." At first, Atis did not respond. "May I come in?" Father's voice came again. "I want to be alone," Atis said irritably, despite not seeing his father. "I really want to do this, but the taste of this honey juice is really sweet." A sound of metal collision came from outside the door, and my father pushed the door in. In the moment he pushed the door, Atis briefly forgot about the grief brought by his beloved dog's death, because the first thing that caught his eyes was his father's silver hair all over his head. "I'm so old that I can't bear it anymore." Jon Eileen's first sentence turned out to be this. My father didn't pay attention to Atis's silence, but instead said to himself, "Dear Robert, during the Robert Uprising, I didn't feel old yet and could still mount a horse to kill the enemy." Of course, that was just a momentary matter, and it wasn't until I finally moved into the camp that I gave up on that idea. Father propped up his wrinkled face and raised an eyebrow at him. Afterwards, I decisively handed over the command of military operations to those young people, many of whom were from the valleys, rivers, and northern regions. Some of them I really liked, almost those I watched grow up with. Some of them seemed immature and needed more experience, but later on, things like Seagull Town, the Summer Hall, the Battle of the Trident River, the Battle of the Bell, and the Siege of Fushi Fortress. Atis listened quietly to the series of place names announced by his father, knowing that they were all important parts of the Robert Uprising. Many young people died on the battlefield. Most of them were in their prime, but they were buried in this unnecessary war. Many of my familiar old friends, whether they were nobles or commoners, noble or lowly, disappeared like shooting stars in the night sky of the valley. My father said calmly, as his aging and hollow eyes seemed to hide the Milky Way of the valley, deep and with a hint of sadness. Jon Eileen suddenly changed his tone. This idea is especially strong when I deal with things that Robert should have taken up time to solve: prostitution. He even gave Atis a squeeze. For the Eileen family, it mainly refers to you, Atis. Father looked down at himself curled up and said, "Today you are sad because of your beloved dog's death, tomorrow you are sad because of your friend's death. One day I will also pass away, perhaps soon. As the heir of the valley, will you only cry? Above glory, Atis, above glory, crying will not have any benefit to glory. Hold up your responsibility, no matter what your king and the people you want to protect are, the cost of glory is great. While giving up your cowardice, you also need to have eagle eyes that pierce through everything and be prepared to pounce on the ground at any time, even if you are shattered to pieces." Afterwards, his father hurried back to Junlin, and they parted ways for several years. Atis felt as heavy as an injection of lead all over his body. Whenever he pondered his father's teachings about the education of his eldest son and heir, he always felt tired. His dream was to travel the entire known world, from the land of winter to the sea of summer, from Essos to the land of shadows. It was so graceful and free-spirited that he realized what it meant to be the heir of the valley before giving up. Dong dong. A knocking sound came from the door. "Atis, it's me, Anda." Anda Royce, Jon's eldest son, Atis thought to himself, "Wait a moment, Anda." Wearing his shirt and opening the door, Anda's thin and shrewd face, like his father's, entered Atis's sight. Atis pointed to the golden wine on the round table behind him and said, "Thank you to your father for his thoughtful hospitality. The golden wine from Chinting Island is the most refreshing." Anda just nodded, as if eager to get to the point. "Atis, I heard you have a younger brother." Anda took a sip of wine and looked at Atis. "The new eagle in the valley, of course I know, Anda. I'm glad to have a younger brother." Atis lay comfortably in the adjacent chair, swaying. Anda first realized something and quickly congratulated, "This is really a great celebration for the valley. Congratulations to Lord Eileen, who is far away at King's Landing." He changed his tone and said, "However, I'm a bit worried. I heard that my younger brother is healthy, well-nourished, and healthy." "There's no need to worry, the eagles of the Eileen family have always been healthy," replied Atis calmly. Young master's health naturally doesn't need to worry." Anda paused, "But what I'm worried about is Mrs. Eileen." The first thing Atis reacted to was his mother, Leuna Eileen. But he quickly ruled her out. He knew that Anda referred to either Lisa Tully or Lisa Eileen. Atis did not respond, but quietly looked at Anda. When catching prey, the eagle only lands once, observe carefully, he thought to himself. "Mrs. Eileen always seems to be neurotic," Anda whispered. "Many people can testify that such rumors exist in valleys, King's Landing, and many places." Atis did not respond. Anda seemed to have a bit more courage when she saw this. "It's not just a mental illness, I heard she and Littlefinger." Anda nervously swallowed. "Littlefinger and Lisa are both on the throne. This cunning guy from the Five-Finger Peninsula has to guard against Atis. A feeling of disgust surged from Atis's chest, but he still had no expression. For him, showing the unity of the family was particularly important. My younger brother is a true eagle, Mrs. Lisa is a respected valley mother, and the Royce family is sworn in allegiance to the Eileen family. You should be aware of this. Anda took a sip of the wine. Of course, Royce is determined to defend the honor of the Eileen family to the death. Honor, Atis thought to himself, feeling a little tired of the word game and holding the handle of the glass tightly. Anda leaned closer to the table and whispered, I didn't mean to do this. I'm looking for a book garden at www.zhaoshuyuan.com, but Mrs. Leisha's instability is well known. Atis remembered the look in Mrs. Lesa's eyes. Lord Atis Eileen, the Royce family is determined to defend you to the death. Anda seemed to blurt out all the words she needed to convey, and then she talked to herself about the naming day of Weimar. Laughter could be heard from the room from time to time. After seeing off Anda, Atis closed the door and carefully reflected on Anda's statement. He couldn't help but worry whether this represented the voice of the valley nobles. Since Lady Leisha's previous impolite behavior at the Eagle's Nest banquet, her emotional changes have been precisely noticed by the valley nobles, causing many nobles and wealthy knights in the valley to feel uneasy. This land surrounded by the Mingyue Mountains has become accustomed to stability, and the people and even nobles living in it do not like unstable leadership. But excluding other factors, the loyalty of the Royce family did indeed reach his heart, and although Anda's way may have made him unhappy, he undoubtedly can trust this family. I am the attendant of Bronze Moon Royce, and it is highly likely that I will be awarded a knighthood by him in the future. The significance of this political binding is self-evident. Besides, there is also friendship with Weimar. As for Littlefinger, since his father let him take over the tax affairs of Haiyu Town, it has caused dissatisfaction among the majority of the valley nobles. They were first dissatisfied that this little nobleman from the Five-Finger Peninsula could dominate the entire valley and use the power of the Imperial Council to oppress them. He was financially domineering, but did not show any gratitude for the significant improvement in fiscal revenue. Thinking about it, Atis fell asleep. He remembered the bobcat Adam, and his real eldest son identity was left in reality. There was no Atis Eileen in the dream. 3. From Bloodgate to King's Landing. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Weimar's naming day didn't have much flower work, it was just that Sir Royce took his 3 children to hunt in the woods. Weimar personally shot a rabbit, and he was so excited that he refused to hand it over to the instructor all day, one of which was placed in his own prey basket. However, no one told him that this rabbit was a specially prepared prey for him, but the smile on Lord Yon's face and the cheers from the people around him could already make Weimar happy for a while. I simply packed up some luggage and put on a slim-fitting aristocratic armor, with a sky-blue eagle soaring on the white moon on my chest. The blue cloak was also embroidered with eagles, and dozens of valley knights around me were also dressed in blue cloaks. The convoy of Rune City was guarded by knights in the middle of the road, and there were also 100 free riders in addition to the valley knights. The convoy was filled with countless gifts, jewelry, and food. Sir John Royce personally led the convoy and walked side by side with Atis towards the King's Landing. At the beginning of the team's departure, Weimar rode his horse and followed closely behind until the team truly entered the valley before reluctantly leaving. Atis noticed that he was still holding the gift he had given him, so he waved his hand briefly. Atis followed Lord John's footsteps without looking back and walked towards the depths of the valley. Prior to this, he had already fed the bobcat Adam with Weimar, gradually familiarizing it with Weimar's scent. He asked Weimar to swear to take care of Adam for himself, and Weimar did the same, with tears flashing in her eyes as she swore. There is usually only one land route out of the valley. Entering the King's Road from the Blood Gate will lead you smoothly to the King's Landing. Most valley dwellers often choose a faster and more convenient route, starting from Haiyu Town and heading straight towards Junlin Port. But due to the need to merge with the Blood Gate Knight, Black Fish, Brynden Tully to reach the King's Landing, he chose this route. The flag of the Eileen family and the flag of the Royce family spread out one after another, and this team was unobstructed in the valley until they reached the Blood Gate. Atis dismounted from his horse, and although the narrow road leading to the Blood Gate was made of stone and looked like a masterpiece, riding horses was still too difficult to pass through. He looked up and saw the stone masonry work on the other side, with peaks suddenly unfolding in layers. Endless green fields connected to the azure sky, and the snow at the mountaintops was like the finishing touch. The morning light bathed the entire Eileen Valley, and the whole scene was so beautiful that the entire team was silent and unable to breathe. The team slowly advanced for about 2 or 3 days, and they had reached the bottom of the valley. The dangerous cliffs on both sides of the Blood Gate in the distance were faintly visible, and the valley had covered almost all the sunlight. A gloomy and dark atmosphere descended above the team. And the scouts and cavalry dispatched in advance from the Blood Gate led the way and cut down some dead trees and branches. Sweat soaked through the armor, and the team suddenly stopped. Atis looked up and saw 2 huge watchtowers clinging to the rock layers, connected by a weathered yet indestructible grey stone-sealed arch bridge. The archer on the battlements of the Blood Gate had already raised his bow, and the knight led by him asked, "Who wants to pass through the Blood Gate?" Atis rode forward and said, "Duke of Eagle's Nest, guardian of the Valley of Erin, guardian of the eastern realm of the 7 kingdoms, and heir to Jon Eileen, the eldest son of King Robert, Atis Erin must pass through the Blood Gate." The voice from the city tower continued, "In the name of Jon Eileen, Duke of Eagle's Nest, guardian of Eileen Valley, and guardian of the eastern territory of the 7 kingdoms, I allow you to pass through the Blood Gate." The gate of the city gate slowly opened, and the crossbowmen and infantry inside walked out in unison. The formation opened a gap in the middle, and Brynden strode out and knelt in front of Atis, saying, "Lord Atis." In the eyes of Atis, Brynden's blue pupils were particularly eye-catching, with thick eyebrows lying below his forehead. The heavy armor on his body made a sound as he knelt down. "This is the Black Fish," Atis thought to himself and said, "Please, Lord Blood Knight." John Royce beside Atis remained silent and swung his horse straight into the city gate, followed by the entire team as they crossed the Blood Gate. Brynden took Atis up the tower of the Blood Gate and said, "Lord Eileen, please do as you please. I will follow you later." After speaking, he turned around and walked into the watchtower. The terrain of the Blood Gate is narrow, with limited space, and few large legions can gather here. Although the 2 watchtowers are huge, most of the space is used to store weapons and food. The Blood Gate defenders are roughly around 500, but the sealed Blood Gate can hinder the progress of tens of thousands of troops, let alone the countless manpower and material support behind the Blood Gate in Eagle Nest City. There have been countless times in history when a large army attacked the Blood Gate with the intention of occupying Eagle's Nest City, but they all stopped fighting in front of the Blood Gate and were unable to advance. It was not until the appearance of the Tangrian dragon that Eagle's Nest City was declared conquered. My father often told me that the Blood Gate Knight was the true Duke of Eagle's Nest during times of war, and could command all available armies in Eagle's Nest. Therefore, the Blood Gate Knight must have absolute loyalty to the family. Brynden Tully is not an outsider, he is the knight I trust the most, his father once whispered in his ear. Atis caressed the city wall that guarded the Eileen family for thousands of years, and the soldiers in the surrounding valley looked at him curiously. Atis smiled and looked at these soldiers. "Why, do you think Eileen's eagle hair hasn't grown up yet?" Atis's words amused many soldiers, some even burst into laughter in front of Atis. "Did you see the convoy below? There are many fruits and drinks hidden inside. I will leave some for you to drink less," Atis said to the defending soldiers as he raised his glass to them. This caused a burst of cheers, and some soldiers even called out Atis's name, Atis. Atis. The strong voice of the soldiers echoed in the canyon, attracting everyone's attention. At this moment, Atis left the city tower. Atis and Jon briefly stayed behind the blood gate, only to see Brynden change his armor, his cloak fluttering behind him, and the galloping horse moving with agile steps in front of them. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been waiting for a long time. King's Avenue is waiting for us." Brynden nodded to Atis and quickly passed through the crowd. At the moment of turning his head, Atis saw a black fish-shaped pin pinned to the cloak of Brynden. "Throughout history, the Blood Gate Knights have never been made by outsiders," said Jon Royce calmly as he looked at Brynden's distant figure. "Duke Eileen never treated the black fish as an outsider," said Sam, the Rune City coach who remained silent behind him. "Yeah, that's what matters." Jon's voice echoed beside Atis, "The black fish's remarkable achievements in battle are admirable." Sir Royce and Atis advanced together. In comparison, there are few heroes in the valley who can match him. Atis heard a hint of resentment, but he didn't make a sound. He just rode silently in the middle of the queue, listening to the valley knights chattering to relieve his stress. After walking out of the Blood Gate, the horses appeared excited like people, and the speed of the team significantly increased. Especially when walking towards King's Road, the road was spacious enough for 10 riders to run parallel. Of course, the spacious King's Road only appeared in one section, and when approaching Herrenberg, King's Road appeared relatively narrow, with vast and boundless farmland on both sides. After walking for a distance, King's Road was even used as a place to dry food, without any road appearance. "Great long summer dot." The bard following the procession finally spoke up. As they passed by the valley, Atis had been hoping that he could open his voice and create, perhaps singing a classic song. However, the poet's weak body could not support his thoughts. He often hit on the material carriage while walking in the valley, and after a few steps, he became exhausted. Gradually, the speed of the team's progress slowed down, and the number of residents and free riders walking on King's Road gradually increased. Fortunately, the weather was sunny all the way and there was no rainy season, otherwise the mud along the way would make it difficult for the team to move. Approaching Junlin, without seeing the city's appearance, one can hear the bustling voices of the city. A square-shaped high wall stands on the north bank of the Heishui River, and King's Avenue leads directly to the Gates of the Gods, one of the 7 gates of the Imperial Palace. Outside the gates, hundreds of golden-robed guards attempted to evacuate a path through the dense crowd, but only caused larger conflicts. Occasionally, people were knocked down by the golden robe, making the crowd even more noisy. The convoy took several hours to enter the city. Even a flag of the Royce family was being passed along at some point, and Atis only saw the iron-blue face of Lord Jon, knowing the fate of the flag-bearer. After entering the city, Atis decided to take a few of the Eileen family guards straight along the main road to the Red Castle, which was much smoother and more enjoyable than crossing the city gate. When he arrived at the Red Castle, the guards led him directly to the Prime Minister's tower. Atis stopped at the entrance of the Prime Minister's tower for a long time before saying to the guards, "Brother, where is the Prime Minister?" "The Prime Minister is in the Imperial Council, young master." The breastplate of the guards is engraved with the eagle medal of the Eileen family, obviously the father's personal guard. "Madam and young master are on the Prime Minister's tower. Do you want to go up and take a look?" "No need, I'm waiting for my father here." Atis didn't want to meet Mrs. Lessa and the brother he had never met alone. "After a long time, the familiar appearance of my father caught my eye, but he was even thinner than usual. His clothes were unusually wide and his silver-gray hair was even sparser than before. He was accompanied by a stranger beside him, but Atis couldn't resist the excitement in his heart, so he threw up his thigh and rushed over. "Atis!" Jon Eileen exclaimed, "You're almost breaking me apart." Atis hugged his father tightly, unwilling to let go. "This is the eldest son of the Prime Minister," said the stranger beside him with a smile as he looked at the father and son. "He really has an extraordinary appearance. The eagles in the valley often emerge as heroes in their youth, just like our respected Prime Minister." A slender voice came from not far away, and Atis released his arm and looked at the two who spoke. These are the important courtiers of the court, Atis. This is Betur Berechi, the Chancellor of the Exchequer of King Robert. The father pointed to a stranger who had been by his side and said. Littlefinger, Atis thought to himself. Littlefinger is not tall, but he has a handsome appearance. His grey-green eyes seem extremely agile, and there is always a smile on his lips. A humble person doesn't need to be personally introduced by the Prime Minister, said the chubby man walking beside him with an exaggerated smile. Of course, Wallace, the world doesn't care about my name, but more about my eunuch status and the so-called octopus spider title. Too modest, sir. Atis returned to the appearance of the eldest son of the valley, polite, elegant, and valuing honor. The security of the Seven Kingdoms cannot be without Lord Wallace, just as the finances of the Seven Kingdoms cannot be without Lord Berechi. The little finger raised its thumb and looked for the book garden www.zhaozuiyuan.com. How can my job of collecting gold for the king compare to Lord Wallace? The Chancellor of the Exchequer is just a gold digger in the king's dung, and it is said that Lord's little bird has flown across the entire kingdom. Even the danger of the valley may not be as high as the little bird's flight. Wallace was about to speak when he saw his father pressing his hand, so his little finger and Wallace stopped speaking. Atis, you should see your brother now. In just an instant, the expression on the little finger underwent a subtle change, and the curvature of the corners of the mouth deepened. Atis withdrew his gaze, bowed and bid farewell to the two former high-ranking officials, and followed his father up to the Prime Minister's tower. He truly deserves to be the eagle of Eileen Valley, Apetir, Wallace sighed as he folded his hands together. Such humility and courtesy, we have seen several of them among the children of the nobles. For example, our dear little prince. Littlefinger joked. The two of them looked at each other and laughed heartily. The prince is only 6 years old, and the road is still long. Perhaps his childhood stubbornness is just a projection of the emperor's style, and it is also a possibility, Lord Berechi. Wallace made a face and whispered softly. Littlefinger just silently looked at Wallace without giving a response. Unfortunately, it's just a chick now, not yet fully fledged. Littlefinger once again turned the conversation to Atis, smiling and saying, with this young master's humble attitude, he probably would respond like this. Oh, my understanding of the Eileen clan is not as good as that of Lord Littlefinger, after all, I am just a eunuch, Wallace sighed with a wrung wrist. The smile on Littlefinger is even more brilliant. Even eagles will grow up, and their feathers will eventually become wings. Wallace shook his head and turned away, leaving only his little finger to gaze at the figure of the Prime Minister's tower. 4. At Junlin. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The milk carpet, known for its gorgeous and luxurious appearance, was stepped on by Atis at this moment. The fireplace in the Prime Minister's tower bedroom was burning brightly, and the flames danced on the wall. Atis stared at the fireworks in the fireplace in a daze. And his father Jon Eileen impatiently paced back and forth in the long corridor outside, where the deep part led to a small tower used as a toilet, while his stepmother, Lysothuli, was staying inside with her crying brother. Lisa, are you okay? Father asked outside, responding only to the cries of a baby in Mrs. Lisa's sharp rebuke. Be patient, John. Atis couldn't help but laugh and cry when he saw this. His father just shook his head and returned to the bedroom, sitting on a soft chair, panting heavily. Seeing his father trying his best to maintain the dignity of the Prime Minister, Atis was afraid that he would suffocate his body. In no time, Lisa walked into the bedroom with the child in her arms. Her younger brother's pale face was adorned with a pair of big eyes. His eyes slid and he looked around, but soon he noticed the presence of a stranger named Atis and looked at him curiously. Atis blinked at him and stood up to look at Lady Lisa's luggage. Madam, it's been a long time since we last met. You're still so beautiful and charming, he said. Lisa looked even older, her body becoming increasingly bloated and loose, her pale face covered in powder. Of course, her long reddish-brown hair remained smooth, like a cascading red waterfall, still beautiful and moving. Lisa squeezed her face into a big smile and said, "Atis, look at your brother." "Can I hug him?" asked Atis. Lisa was clearly taken aback, her reaction slightly sluggish, of course. The little one left his mother's embrace, swaying his limbs, tears streaming down his face as he was about to cry. However, he found himself with something in his mouth, and his big eyes looked at Atis again. With a strong bite, Atis's finger got stuck in his mouth, causing some pain. Atis tried to keep a smile as he forced a forced smile at Lisa. "My younger brother obviously likes his mother better," he said. Lisa proudly took the child and hugged it in her arms. Father enjoyed the scene, holding his glass and grinning, shaking the soft chair like a rocking chair. The warmth of the fireplace was just right. The Eileen family had been separated for several years and finally reunited in the Prime Minister's tower. "I plan to name him Robert after King Robert," my father took a sip of wine and said to Atis and Lisa. "Oh, my dear Robin, may the brave King Robert give him courage and physique." Lisa gave Robert a deep kiss on his forehead. As it was getting late, the servants of the Prime Minister's tower simply tidied up a table for dinner in the bedroom, and their father finally broke free from the heavy burden of government affairs. He looked relaxed and enjoyed a simple meal with his family. Atis rested very late, and he was never at ease in the Prime Minister's tower, especially after the oil lamps in the room went out. In the darkness, he always felt a pair of eyes staring at him inside the thick wall, making it difficult for him to fall asleep. Not to mention the occasional crying of Robin and the singing of Lisa trying to lull him to sleep in the late night, which kept his exceptionally sensitive five senses tense and sensitive. When he woke up, the sky was still slightly bright. Walking to the battlements of the Prime Minister's tower, he found his father leaving the tower under the escort of his guards, his thin figure disappearing into the car. Atis did not expect the work of the king's hand to be so busy, and his own time to be so tight. Atis picked up his steel sword and walked out of the Prime Minister's tower. He wanted to go and see the school grounds of the Red Castle before visiting the late-returning King Robert from hunting as usual. The end of the Red Castle near the narrow sea is very close to the city wall outside the castle, and its campus is located on a large circular platform on this side. In addition to being used as a campus, soldiers often practice here. The sound of fighting and fighting guided Atis, and in the distance, the flag of the Balakian crown buck fluttered in the wind. Outside the red fortress battlements where the flag was placed was the silent wall of King's Landing, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks of the land could even be faintly heard. There was enough space left in the middle of the school field, and Atis saw a young blonde boy holding a blunt sword aimed at the clown jester in front of him. Prince Joffrey. Atis quickened his pace as he was about to meet the prince. The boy swung his sword fiercely towards the back of the jester. "Ah! His Highness the Prince is skilled in swordsmanship, and I can't even avoid it. Ah!" The jester boasted and flapped on the ground a few times, supporting himself and throwing himself backwards, opening his mouth wide and howling up in sorrow. The onlookers burst into laughter as the knights cheered, "Your Highness the Prince is truly brave," and, "What a great prince!" Cheers spread from all directions. Atis did not come to the school field alone. The blue-robed soldiers of the Eileen family always followed him, and the group immediately attracted many gazes. The golden robes next to the prince made way and lowered their heads in silence. "Although my father is not here, he seems to be behind me at this moment," Atis thought to himself. But the Lannister guards next to the prince remained unmoved. They looked hesitantly at the young son of the Prime Minister in front of them. Atis noticed that the prince's own family of Byrasian's personal soldiers had gathered in the distance of the schoolyard, looking calmly at this place. Joffrey felt the cheers from the surroundings disappear, and everyone's attention was not on him. His face turned red as he swung his sword and continued to hit the poor jester. A few red marks appeared on the jester's face in an instant, and he screamed sadly, not pretending this time. Upon seeing this, Atis had to kneel on one knee in front of Joffrey and said, "Your Highness, Atis from the Eileen family pays tribute to you." Joffrey stopped torturing the jester and impatiently looked at Atis kneeling beside him. The jester quickly leaned back to catch his breath and said, "Which poor and remote place did you come from?" "He is the eldest son of the current Prime Minister, Prince Joffrey." The knight, who had been observing in front of the battlements, walked over. The exquisite white scales embroidered with gold thread showed his solid physique, and the knee pads, throat pads, hand guards, and boots were all made of iron armor, shining brightly in the sunlight. Junlin Taiwei. His white robe was particularly prominent, and the exquisite hanging figure carving on his sword hilt showed his family identity before his oath. Sir Marin Tran, Atticus bowed slightly to pay his respects to the Tran family's Marin Tran, oh, that old man with bad breath. Joffrey was only 6 years old, and his contempt was already skillfully expressed between his teeth. "Yeah, ha ha ha, the Prime Minister, old man with bad breath." The Lannister guards around immediately cheered. Prince Joffrey's speech is insightful. The familiar praise sounded again, and it turned out to be the jester on the ground. Joffrey noticed him and screamed, "Hey, Joker. Do you have a place to talk?" After finishing speaking, he swung his sword and hit him, causing the jester to instinctively dodge. Upon seeing this, Joffrey smiled incredulously and said, "Dare you hide? Dare you hide from the prince's sword? Dog, teach him a lesson." As he spoke, he vigorously punched the jester. "Damn the clown! Damn the clown! Oh, oh!" The jester wept and faced the prince's physical abuse. Atis only then noticed a tall man with a terrifying face among the many cheerers next to Joffrey. He broke open his ugly face and showed a terrifying smile. "Okay, Prince." The tall man picked up the poor and short jester and gently threw it towards the nearby weapon platform. The jester's thin skin instantly cut open several notches, blood overflowing, and the jester loudly begged for mercy. "Your Highness, I'm very sorry. I shouldn't hide, I'm damn. He continued to suck his mouth, tears and snot uncontrollably streaming down his face. Johor smeared tears and snot onto his hair inside to please. Ha ha ha. Laughter exploded like gunpowder around him, and Joffrey himself bent down and covered his stomach, laughing wildly. Marin Tran enjoyed watching all of this, and the ugly man, known as the dog, stood beside him laughing. "Yes, you shouldn't hide, you son of a bitch. Please allow me to leave, Your Highness the Prince." Atis watched coldly as he whispered and left. Atis didn't want to see such a scene, so he left the prince's training ground in frustration and walked to the utensil not far from the royal guard of Byrasian. He was frustrated that the prince was so arrogant at such a young age that he didn't want to have too much interaction with him. Although his likes and dislikes were well hidden in his heart at the age of 12, there was still a reaction in his heart, not to mention that Joffrey's disrespect to the king's prime minister made him doubt whether he was a good prince. When Atis turned around again, he was shocked to find a family emblem behind the jester's clothes. Upon careful identification, he could not identify which nobleman it came from, but it must be a wealthy knight class. The prince's behavior is not very appropriate, Atis thought silently. He no longer had the mood to appreciate the Red Castle campus, and left the campus with the guards of the Eileen family. According to his father's instructions last night, Atis arrived at the White Sword Tower, which has always been the dormitory of 7 imperial guards. After seeking advice from the guards outside the tower, he waited quietly. After calming down the emotions triggered by his encounter with the prince, it now stirred up another wave, as he was about to meet the greatest knight in the world, the fearless Sir Barristan Selmy. While exploring the world of imagination, Barristan had quietly descended from the tower and approached him. Atis caught a glimpse of his figure, with white hair and white armor. He immediately reacted and exclaimed excitedly, "Barry! Sir Barristan! Balistan walked briskly, looking so strong and elegant to Atis. Please express my respect to your father, the young man from the Eileen family. Of course, sir. Atis tried to speak as briefly as possible. Balistan looked at himself with his sad blue eyes, exactly as the bachelor described. Atis also looked at him, thinking excitedly. The Jazz's white hair was combed long and smooth like occasional fluff in a valley of snow. Perhaps it should be cut short, Atis couldn't help but think. Atis. Your name is Atis, right? Yes, sir, Atis replied. Balistan pinched the muscles on Atis's arm and asked, only 12 years old. After receiving recognition, he patted Atis's light armor in appreciation. Pick up your sword and let me see how you're doing. Atis's eyes lit up upon hearing this, and he excitedly drew out his steel sword, looking at Barristan excitedly. Did you start practicing the bladed steel sword so early? Balistan flashed his blue eyes and looked at him with a smile, pulling out his own long sword. Atis stabilized his lower plate, pressed his feet against the ground, and looked earnestly at the white knight in front of him. Balistan didn't waste time and took the initiative to expose his back to Atis, then turned around and swung his long sword towards Atis. Atis steadily used his sword to parry and defend, and the heavy power transmitted from his sword almost escaped. He seized the opportunity and thrust his sword towards the back of Balistan's armor with a single arrow step. Just as the tip of the sword was about to stab Barristan's back, Atis was even considering whether to stop and express himself appropriately. But Barristan's back quickly shifted under his eyes, and the pain in his back preceded his attack. He suddenly realized that Sir Barristan was hitting him with the back of his sword, and he fell heavily to the ground. In an instant, he quickly supported the ground with one hand, and a roll opened up space with Sir Barristan. The long sword is indeed not suitable for close combat, young man. Balistan saw his posture and his expression of appreciation grew stronger. But we also need to see who the opponent is, right? Balistan put away his relaxed expression and looked at him seriously. Atis was not discouraged by the defeat in this attack. He took a few deep breaths, calmed his breath and mind, and stood with his sword. The sound of sword strikes kept coming from the air, sweat sliding down his cheeks, and his feet were suddenly struck by a long sword. Atis felt his calf being heavily struck by the back of the sword, and his lower body suddenly lost balance. His upper body was once again heavily struck by the Jazz's elbow, and Atis fell to the ground again. Atis's handsome face suddenly turned green, with a slight swelling on the left side. He gasped for breath and held on to the bangs in front of his forehead, stumbling and then standing up again. Young man, you are already very powerful. The Oath Brothers of the Imperial Forest Iron Guard cannot withstand me for a few rounds. Balistan pulled Atis up and touched his hair. And you and I have fought back and forth. Atis just forced a smile, he guessed the Jazz was just talking about the scene. Sir James can only play with you for a few rounds, he asked curiously. Balistan didn't expect him to ask this question and burst into laughter. Sir James is a brave enough knight with exquisite martial arts, but he has a bit of a temper. Great knights have always been like this, and we often end up in a standoff. The Great Knight, this is not the case in the comments about James Lannister accepted by Atis. Valley Knights often refer to this person as regicide, including their own father who often referred to James Lannister in private. The two of them were chatting and laughing, looking up from afar, one big and one small. The slanted shadows pulled down by the sunlight dragged into the shade of the trees on the side, which was clearly seen by others as an unforgettable friendship. At dusk, a team surged from the edge of the Imperial Forest, and the flag of the Baoguan Buck was sprinkled with the afterglow of the sunset, like a golden powder decoration. King Robert rode on a horse, his fat but still robust body trembling on the steed, and the attendant beside him closely followed on a pony. In no time, a white-robed knight turned back in front of him, with a particularly dazzling head of blonde hair, clearly referring to James Lannister as mentioned by Atis. "Your Majesty, the eldest son of the Eileen family has been waiting for a long time." Robert was momentarily taken aback, then burst out laughing heartily. His throat trembled up and down, as if his whole body was trembling. "The little eagle from the Eileen family is here. Hurry, let's go to the Red Fort." Robert leaped his horse, and the guards behind him hurriedly followed. As soon as he entered the gates of King's Landing, many residents recognized him. The thunderous cries of "Long live King Robert" chased Robert's footsteps like the wind. By the time Robert saw Atis, the sun had completely set, and Jon Eileen had also escaped from politics and arrived at the hall of the Red Castle, where the Iron Throne, symbolizing power, was situated. Atis Eileen knelt on one knee in front of the Iron Throne, and all the important officials in front of him had already appeared. He had already met the Littlefinger Bettier Barry and the Minister of Intelligence, Wallace. The stern Sea Minister, dressed meticulously like an iron face, stood in front of the courtiers and said, "Stannis Baratheon." Atis silently recited, as rumored. Trapped in the middle, leaning on a crutch, was the scholar Pazzer. He noticed Atis's gaze and nodded slightly in greeting, but his eyes were lowered, as if asleep. Balistan stood upright on a high platform, holding the hilt of his sword, while the prince, whom he had seen during the day, was standing next to the White Knight with a disdainful expression on his face. My father sat on a small seat below the Iron Throne, encouraging Atis. Atis walked forward with a smile and knelt on one knee. "Your Majesty, Atis from the Eileen family sends his greetings to you." Robert, who sat on the Iron Throne, looked at Atis with satisfaction. He pointed at Atis and said, "You guys keep an eye on me, this is my little brother." Stannis frowned at the words below and turned his face away. Atis also clearly saw his father's face twitch, slightly embarrassed. The courtiers and the aristocratic women gathered in the hall cheered and applauded one after another, which made Atis wonder if Joffrey wanted to emulate his father and enjoy the surrounding cheers. Robert grinned incessantly, seeming to be very useful. He waved his hand and said, "Atis, the eagle of the valley, why don't you come closer and let me take a look, Stannis took a step forward and said, "Your Majesty, with all due respect, the Iron Throne must not be trampled upon at will. Stop talking if you know more. Atis, come over here." Robert impatiently looked at Atis, who could only walk up the high platform made up of countless swords. Stannis turned his iron-blue face and strode out of the hall. Varys flattered him with a sweet smile as he left, and Stannis snorted coldly without turning back. Robert didn't care about his second brother. He looked at Atis's sturdy body and said, "I went to war as soon as you were born, and I only saw you a few times. You're so strong now. Hey Jon, there's someone in your valley now, ha ha ha. This is simply a natural guardian of the East, ha ha ha." After saying this, he even turned around Atis, allowing him to enjoy the cheers of everyone clearly. "You should see Joffrey more often. He has a temper that follows me, and we definitely get along ha." Robert looked at Prince Joffrey next to Barristan, who pouted his little mouth provocatively at Atis. "I have already met His Royal Highness the Prince this morning. His diligence is impressive, and his martial arts skills are equally intimidating." Atis complimented proficiently, and after speaking, he felt that Joffrey's mouth, not far away, was about to curl up into the sky. 7 gods, who gave this kid a likable mouth? Robert laughed heartily. "Atis, keep some of the kid's cleverness. Seeing you is like seeing Ned in the far north. Ah. But he doesn't have your mouth, but you two are very similar." Robert let out a deep sigh and patted his shoulder. When Atis came down, his mind was dizzy, and a smile hung on his face. Robert saw this scene and nodded satisfied, "All right, enjoy dinner." He waved his hand and stepped off the high platform of the Iron Throne, entering his dimple. The singers sang about bears and beautiful girls, and the entire hall was filled with laughter and music. The crude music made his father feel uncomfortable, but he still smiled and said to himself, "Be happy, Robert specially gave you a dinner." This song is crude, but it is also a piece of music that reflects Robert's wisdom. Wisdom. Atis was a bit confused, so he just picked up a knife and fork to enjoy the exquisite food at the dinner party. Zhaozuiyuan.com little finger smiled and raised his glass to look at him, while Atis also raised his glass to show respect, but his cup was filled with sweet milk. Not far from Atis, a few pairs of eyes were consciously or unconsciously observing the situation near him. Even when the maid handed Atis milk, she skillfully took over the maid's work and chose to personally give it to Atis. His companion threw away the cup and replaced it with new milk, which was the one in Atis's hand. On the tall tower not far away, a woman in red who looked very similar to Sir James was looking at the celebration here. For a little bald eagle, Robert went to great lengths. A vicious voice came from her mouth. Tari actually arranged a cozy little bed, with James Lannister lying on it. He said disapprovingly, to demonstrate the unity of the deer and eagle families, he is also paving the way for little Joe. It's still our Lannister money, James. Cersei sat on James' lap, looking at him with emerald green eyes. James felt his whole body captivated by Cersei's breath, deeply immersed in it. When he realized it, he had already pressed Cersei onto the bed and kissed her hard. "Don't worry, it's just a little golden dragon," James said in a low voice, listening to Cersei's breathing as they rolled on the bed. Before the dinner ended, Atis and his father returned to the Prime Minister's tower. His father was drunk, which caused a wave of disgust from Lady Lisa. She ordered her servants to settle her father in bed, while she carried Robin to the reception room to rest. Atis didn't return to his room to rest until his father was snoring like thunder. Looking back all day, Atis rubbed his sore arm, which was evidence of fighting against the greatest knight. He fell asleep with joy. 5. A Mysterious Banditry. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At the age of 12, Atis was visiting King's Landing for the first time, and he only stayed there for 2 weeks when the White Knight Balistan and the Prime Minister's father personally escorted him out of the city and back to the valley. As the eldest son of the valley, he was asked to visit every family and vassal in the valley. Count John Royce once again accompanied him, and before leaving, he had another conflict with his father. "Forgive me for being blunt, Lord Eileen, you have to trust others too much." Lord Royce shouted angrily at his father. "Trust is the cornerstone of mutual cooperation, John." Father replied, and in the end, the two parted ways unhappily. The knights and attendants around them looked at each other, and at the end of their conversation, they both followed their lords as if they had been granted amnesty. Atis noticed that the main points of contention between his father and Lord Royce were the customs taxes in Seagull Town, the expansion of fortresses along the valley coast, whether the valley belonged to the Tully or Eileen families, and even the issue of sovereignty over the King's Crab Claw Peninsula. Despite the seemingly harmonious relationship between the Osprey and Eagle families, the vassals under the Eagle family were restless and discontent was slowly growing. "Your father is still too weak in this regard." John kicked the horse under his crotch and openly expressed his dissatisfaction in front of Atis. He threw the finances of the valley to the cunning little finger, handed over the Blood Gate to Tully, and the Eagle Nest City didn't know who was in charge. As the Grand Administrator of the Eileen Valley, Nest was idle at the Moon Gate Castle all day. John clenched his fist and sighed as he looked at the gradually gloomy sky in the distance. Atis remembered his father's advice to him. "Atis, there are many ambitious feudal lords in the valley, and the one you serve, John Royce, is one of them. But please trust his loyalty. He only has a strong local attachment to the valley. He is skilled in leading troops in war and handling disputes with lords, but he cannot interfere in diplomacy and trade." Royce's comment also surprised Atis. "Our Lord Eileen has handled foreign affairs beautifully enough, and made King Robert's poop not so bad, but he has messed up the family affairs in the valley." Atis had always regarded Jon's words as the mainstream view of the valley aristocracy, but at this time he could not distinguish them. The cloudy rain blew for a while, and the sky swayed in the wind with the erratic rain lines. After a brief rest in the inn, the group of people set off again in the valley. The pony under Atis maintained a slow and steady pace in the cloudy rain, and it was accustomed to heavy rain in the valley. The road before leaving the King's Landing was monotonous gray, and the mountains were bare. Before the fields were full of vitality, only 2 weeks had passed, but they became lifeless. The sun-dried food on the road was probably taken away by the farmers, and the King's Road was muddy, making it difficult for the carriage to walk. Jon and a group of valley knights had dismounted and walked, while Atis fell behind the line. He was pushing a cart carrying goods with Headmaster Sherdong, blacksmiths, and servants from Rune City. After returning to the valley for another week, he stood on the stone bridge of the Blood Gate again, gazing at the mountain road when he arrived. He didn't know how many years he would stay in this mountain range again. And later scholars will tell him that it will be 4 years later, which is 296 years in the Aegon calendar. On the school field in Fushi City, Wyma held a long spear, shook the green cloak behind him, patted the galloping horse under his crotch, and said to Atis in the distance, "Don't worry, Atis, we all use martial arts long spears, it's difficult to hurt anyone." On the other side, Atis straightened his helmet, wearing exquisite double-ring armor to simply protect his torso, and slowly lowered his spear, swaying and swaying. He gave Wyma a simple smile, lightly kicked the mount with both legs, and walked forward. The atmosphere gradually solidified, and Coach Samwell Sherdong stood high, calmly looking at the two who were facing each other. Wymer's sister, Athena, nervously looked at Atis, her hands entwined nervously. The horn sounded, and the two riders slowly started, both intending to gradually accelerate and attack each other. Wyma stood the shield on the side and handed the long spear between the lightning and flint, but the force was not accurate, and it shattered instantly when it collided with Atis's breastplate. At the same time, Atis's silver spear pretended to pass through Wymer's shield and hit Wymer's chest from the side. At the moment of handing over the gun, the space between the two of them grew and fell, hitting each other's chest. Wyma's spear shattered and he himself was overturned and dismounted. Atis rushed out a few meters before stopping the horse's hooves, turned around and immediately dismounted, running to Wyma's side. Seeing that he had nothing to do, he kept a certain distance until he stood up on his own. "Good guy," Wymer said excitedly, "your armor must be harder." Atis approached and said, "Are you still here, Wilma?" He saw Ysena sliding down from the high platform, holding a glass of water in her hand. "Never mind, I won't let you knock me off the horse again." Wyma reluctantly returned to his mount, grabbed the beer handed by the servant, and drank it all in one gulp. "Atis, do you need a drink?" Ysena rushed over, wearing a pink long dress, like a pink butterfly fluttering in the flower bushes. Atis thanked her softly, raised his cup, and used the base of the cup to give her a charming smile, making Athena blush on both cheeks. Wyma glanced at her with a slanted gaze and a slight smile on her lips. Father has been creating opportunities for Atis and his sister to get along with each other. Wyma chuckled inwardly, knowing that Atis had no interest in Athena at all, especially since Duke Eileen had been trying to reconcile with the Tyrell family in the River Bend. At the end of the day, Atis and Wymer returned to the city of Rune and saw Sir Wymer Royce teaching his 11-year-old servant Harold Hutton archery. This servant was his cousin's grandson, and since her death, Harold has been adopted by the head of the Waywood family, Anya Waywood. According to the inheritance order of the Eileen family, due to the unfortunate circumstances of his own family, there were too many cases of premature death, and this Harold Hutton was actually the third-in-line inheritor of the valley after himself and Robert Eileen. Sir Royce nodded slightly to himself and continued teaching Harold how to shoot arrows. Atis could see that the boy was very talented. There are few male soldiers visible in the castle, and most of the soldiers have fled. Only a small number of crossbowmen and spearmen patrolled the towers and the city. The two sons of the Count have both been ordered to lead troops into the Eileen Valley, suppressing the increasingly rampant bandits along the way. This group of fugitives is very difficult to deal with, often disappearing in the mountains and forests to avoid pursuit. When not under surveillance, they engage in mass killings in the valley, plundering livestock and food, and committing all kinds of evil. It is said that they are a pirate group that cannot survive on the narrow sea, and have bypassed the tightly guarded coastal defense of the valley and entered the range of the Mingyue Mountains. The Eileen family has a traditional lineage of the Andar people, and the invasion of the Andar people began on the Five-Finger Peninsula. Throughout their history, the guardians of the valley have known how they gained control of this land. Since the founder of the Eileen family and the first king of the Valley Kingdom, Atis Erin of the same name, the construction and maintenance of the coastal trade ports in the valley have always been secondary, with coastal fortresses and towers being the primary projects. Even during the period when the Eileen family spent a huge amount of money on building Eagle's Nest on the Giant Spear, the consolidation of the coastal defense has never been left behind. Therefore, the spread of the bandits from the narrow sea to the Mingyue Mountains this time is indeed a mystery. "He must be a damn iron man," Waima guessed. He was almost 18 years old, and his original intention to go to the Great Wall was finally stopped by the joint persuasion of Atis and his father Jon. In fact, the main reason why Waima wanted to go to the Great Wall was because as the third son of John Royce, his chances of inheritance were slim, and he was not much better than his two brothers. However, Atis's arrival changed all of this. Waima actually knew in her heart that as long as she could adventure with Atis, she would definitely be able to achieve great success, and her father Yuan's ideas may also be related to this. Atis did not deny his speculation, as he shared wine from Qingting Island with Waima. "Iron people are accustomed to plundering, entering from the river, burning, killing, and looting them is a decline," said Waima indignantly. "Iron people do not like self-sufficiency in agriculture and take pride in plundering for a living. They have ample experience in seizing waterways and going ashore to plunder. Moreover, after years of fighting with the valley, they are very clear about the defense line of the valley coast, so this speculation is possible." Atis calmly told Waima, "The scholars of Eagle's Nest have sent ravens to King Robert to inform him of this matter." "Well, it includes your speculation. Perhaps at this time, the Imperial Council is discussing it." Upon hearing this, Waima was somewhat pleased and drank the wine in front of her in one gulp. "By the way, it's been a long time since you returned to Eagle's Nest City. The lords of the valley are now petitioning at the Moon Gate Castle. Uncle Nestor was appointed as the butler by his father, so of course everyone would run to his side. Atis didn't pay attention to this matter. Besides, I'm glad he could help me with something, saving me the trouble of being like your brother and making it seem like everyone owes him 10,000 golden dragons every day." Waima knew he was referring to her older brother Anda, and couldn't close her mouth with a smile, shouting, "Insightful." Atis looked at the large map of the valley hanging on the wall. Moon Gate Castle was located at the bottom of the Mingyue mountain range, and was indeed more popular among petitioners compared to Eagle's Nest City, which needed to climb the mountain road. His eyes scanned both sides of the Five-Finger Peninsula and the Eileen Valley, and most of the bandits were concentrated in the Eileen Valley. However, there were fewer near the ruined city. It seemed that this group of fugitives also entered the Eileen Valley from the Five-Finger Peninsula, and then infiltrated the entire Mingyue mountain range. The Longbow Hall was the first to be attacked by the bandits, and nearby villages were plagued with livestock casualties. Many women were taken away, and male soldiers were killed and injured countless. It is said that the old Count of Hunt in the Longbow Hall was furious with thunder. He had his second son Eustace lead 200 cavalry westward along the Eileen Valley, hoping to find the bandits. At the same time, he had 100 scouts in the city search along the coast, and many wealthy knights from the Five-Finger Peninsula also joined the Longbow Hall scouts team. And Sir Royce's 400 soldiers from Rune City actually went with the soldiers from Seagull Town to strengthen the coastal defense of this peninsula, on a flat peninsula where Rune City and Seagull Town are located in the same valley, although Seagull Town's coast was guarded by a fleet with sufficient soldiers, and the valley even brought mercenary groups from across the narrow sea to serve as daily guards. As Atis analyzed, Waima was carefully wiping the dagger in his hand with a cloth. The dagger had a dull luster and its body was as dark as night. After Lord Ewan gave him the dragon crystal dagger on Waima naming day last year, he kept it with him and maintained it carefully. As the two of them were focused on their own work, the door to the room was rudely opened. Atis looked up and saw that the person coming was the bachelor of the Earl of John, Clovis. The usually calm bachelor was wiping the sweat off his forehead, holding a sealed envelope in his hand, revealing the eagle seal of the Eileen family. Junlin's letter, Master Atis, I believe it was from your father. The scholar looked quite nervous, as if he knew the content of the letter. Waima on the side was also a bit surprised. Her father had never liked people who showed cowardice, whether they were children or subordinates. Do I need to avoid it? Waima asked. I believe my father also left a letter for Sir Royce. Atis took the letter and gestured for Waima to stay. He lay down on the soft chair and opened the envelope. Bachelor Kelwii gave a positive response and then nervously looked at Atis. The wine glass leaned against Atis's mouth, and the liquid was as red as blood, crimson to his lips. The angle at which the glass tilted gradually increased until there was no liquid left in the glass. The room was unusually quiet, and Waima continued to wipe the dagger on her own. The sound of the cloth rubbing could be clearly heard. When Atis looked up, he noticed that the bachelor's palm was sweating. Atis put away the letter and stood up to Waima, saying, Waima, do you want to contribute your efforts to the inheritance of the valley? Waima stopped his actions and quickly replied, I guarantee my honor, Atis. Okay, it seems necessary for us to embark on an adventure together. Atis picked up his long sword and left the room. 6. Longbow Hall Rebellion, 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sir John Royce tacitly agreed to Waima's action of following Atis. He led the remaining hundreds of troops from Rune City to follow Atis and summoned his two sons to join him, embarking on an expedition under the name of Atis. Atis rationalized the content of the letter, which made it difficult for him to calm down. The most important point in the letter is that Ian Hunter, the old Earl of the Archbishop's Bow Hall who has been in power for nearly 60 years, has died, not due to a sudden illness. According to the father's firm belief in the letter, it was Ian Hunter's eldest son's heir, Jaywood Hunter, who poisoned and murdered the old Earl. In addition, Jaywood also imprisoned his youngest brother Harlan Hunter. If the prison guards were not loyal to the old Earl, this information would not have flowed out of the Bow Hall. With the help of the prison guard, the young son Harlan spread the news of Gerald Hunter poisoning the old count, and even told his father that the easy entry of the bandits into the valley was not with the help of the Iron Man, but with the traitor Gerald relaxing the supposed strict guard on the Five-Finger Peninsula. The purpose of hiring pirates to invade the valley was simply to force the brave and skilled second son to lead troops out of the Bow Hall, which was led by the cavalry to search for bandits by Eustace Hunter, so that the entire Bow Hall would be under the control of the traitor Jaywood. He claimed to have seen countless bandits occupying the inside and outside of the castle, and all the women in the castle suffered unhappiness. Father was extremely convinced of this, and he did not believe that Harlan would lie, because the old Earl of Hunter's affection for his young son was well known throughout the entire valley. He said that after careful consideration, he decided to lead his troops to the Longbow Hall and uphold justice. The letter mentioned that Harren requested the prison guard to send the letter directly to Junlin, but the prison guard stated that he was not like a bachelor who could command the ravens, and the scope of sending the letter was limited to the valley. Helpless, Harren had to ask the prison guard to deliver the letter to Eagle Nest City. There's one more strange thing, Atis thought to himself. The young son of the Hunter family did not request the letter to be handed over to Nest Royce, the chief steward of the Valley of Erin, nor did he deliver it to the city of Rune to inform him of the heir of the valley. Instead, it was handed over to Eagle's Nest, which was only managed by a bachelor. Even more strangely, although the father did not explicitly state in the letter the reason for allowing himself to lead troops, he only wanted him to uphold justice and establish honor. Such a significant event, which is related to the prominent aristocrats of the valley, cannot be ordered to go on a campaign just because he wants to gain some prestige and honor, although the great Ewan is the true commander. The most appropriate approach for Atis himself was to send troops from both Moon Gate Castle and Rune City on land, clearing the bandits along the Eileen Valley Road and joining forces with the second son of the Hunter family, Eustace, who was on the expedition. On the other hand, he crossed the Mingyue Mountains and attacked the Longbow Hall from the flank. At the same time, Seagull Town dispatched a fleet to blockade the Wuji Peninsula, and it would be best if Junlin could also dispatch a fleet. This is a major event of aristocratic rebellion. Killing one's family and swearing to the other, Jaywood occupies everything, let alone the Five-Finger Peninsula, which is an important barrier to prevent invasion from the Narrow Sea. As the local top beam family, the Hunter family, and the Order of the Longbow Hall must not be lost. That is to say, even if you lead your own troops, you still need the help of the Grand Marshal Nestor and the naval fleet to be considered appropriate. This concern is mainly due to the fact that my father's letter did not mention a backup team or a second tier of reinforcements. It seems that I just want to establish a reputation in front of the Valley Lords that can be seen from the inside at a glance. Jon walked up to Atis and seemed to see his doubts. He reached out and grabbed Atis's reins, saying, "Are you nervous about following the army for the first time?" Atis shook his head as he focused more on the politics of the valleys and the Seven Kingdoms. "Good child, you will be a good prince," Jon looked at him admiringly, and then said as if to help Atis, "My good relative Nestor is in a bad situation." "General Manager?" Atis asked. "Yes," said Jon, half of his thin face illuminated by the sunlight. The youngest son of the Hunter family mentioned in the letter sent to Eagle's Nest that he often found his communication with Nest Royce of Moon Gate Castle in the room of his traitor brother Jaywood, so he did not believe in the Archbishop of Erin Valley or Royce of Rune. Because of this, the scholars of Eagle's Nest did not send the letter to the nearest nest, but directly to King Lin. This was unexpected by Atis, but he still listened quietly. "Your father, my Duke of Eileen, stated in his letter to me that this is because that Hunter boy is too scared, leading to suspicion." Jon chuckled lightly, with a hint of disdain on his lips. "The right idea." Atis admired his father in his heart. "But Duke Ellen told me that he did not inform Nestor of the contents of the letter and hoped that I would assist you in suppressing the rebellion before discussing it." "This obviously trusts me more than him," said Jon with some resentment. But he had previously handed over the identity of the Grand Governor of Ellen Valley to Nestor, which is simply unbelievable. For some reason, Lord Ewan seemed to enjoy complaining about his father in front of him, and he was quite sensitive. Atis changed the topic and asked, "How many rebels are occupying the Longbow Hall?" "Even with that group of unorganized pirates, it won't exceed 500. Jon seemed to not take the current battle to heart. "When our army meets in the Valley of Erin, there will be nearly 800 soldiers. This is not a big battle, Atis. It's good that they gather together, these bandits," Atis said softly. "Smart, I'm afraid they'll all run into the Mingyue Mountains." Jon quickened his horse steps and ordered the army to increase their marching speed. Wyma saw Jon walking away and then rode up to her side. "Why does my father look unhappy all day?" he asked, looking at the figure in front of him who was walking away, puzzled. "Probably, too proud." Atis couldn't help but want to laugh, and Wyma's surprised gaze also appeared particularly comical. "Adam brought it?" Atis asked. Wyma pointed to the backpack on the horse and whispered, "It's inside. I'm afraid its claws will tear the bag to pieces." Atis seemed to be able to feel the soft moan of the bobcat Adam, and his sense of security suddenly increased. As long as it is by my side, no sword can surpass me. Riding soldiers and horses on the wild grass in the valley, the grass crawled on the ground, succumbing to the tyranny of force. Dust filled the nose, and within a moment of walking, Atis's own lock armor was covered in dust. The path ahead with the dust rising was somewhat blurry, and the surrounding situation of dust enveloping Atis actually made his heart sink. The phrase, small-scale war, reflected in Atis's mind, and he carefully pondered the intention of his father's arrangement. Obviously, his father intended to only send troops to Rune City, keeping the scale to a minimum, as if he did not want the news of the deployment to be leaked. The special terrain of the valley is indeed suitable for hiding messages. The marching team always follows the mountain path. Because of the high mountain clans and bandits, few people are likely to take the risk of entering the mountain path, unless it is a harmless hired knight. Why doesn't the news want to be leaked? Atis lightly caressed his sword around his waist and watched as Weimer waved his hand to drive away the dust. Nestor. Atis found the answer, and his father had doubts about Nestor. This was the only explanation, and I'm afraid Sir Royce's letter also mentioned this, otherwise he wouldn't have reacted so much. Kennest has been diligently managing the valley for many years, and his father, who is far away from King's Landing, should trust him the most. Atis couldn't figure out why, although the youngest son of the Hunter family explained the situation, he still didn't fully understand it, so he had to accept the fact first. Marching day and night, the people and horses were exhausted, and Atis was unwilling to take the risk of stepping out of his own sight. However, sometimes he would quietly release the mountain cat Adam, knowing that he would find Adam the next morning. Not long after entering the Eileen Valley, the famous cavalry commander of the Hunter family, Eustace, and the two sons of John Royce, Anda and Robert, had already found their own army. Eustace Hunter knelt on one knee in front of Atis. He was nearly 40 years old, dressed in thick armor, with a long spear hanging diagonally on his back, and his right hand tightly gripping the sword. His face was clearly neglected for a long time, and his beard was impolite and conspicuous. Atis noticed that there was also a bag of short spears tied to the side of his warhorse. Lord Eileen, Eustace from the Hunter family pays tribute to you. Eustace frowned and sighed long. The Hunter family has brought shame to the valley. He then lowered his head. Atis quickly stepped forward to persuade, no need, Sir Eustace. He felt the deep sense of shame and honor in the kneeling sir. The honor of the Hunter family is related to true knights, and traitors who swear have no right to involve the honor of the Hunter family, Atis said solemnly. Eustace seemed to have no face to see the heir of the valley again, but quickly thanked him before retreating and kept his head down. Atis originally wanted to continue communicating with him, but he didn't force himself to do so. He just remained silent and smiled all the way, trying to take care of the mood of the cavalry commander. Another night arrived, and the tent was simply erected on the hill. The gathering scale of soldiers in the 800 valleys was not large, and the noise of the campfire at night was clear in the quiet of the night. Atis lay on a velvet bed in the tent, which was a privilege he enjoyed as the eldest son of Eileen. The blue-robed personal guards were on either side of his tent, and reinforcements were readily available in case of any emergency. Through the swaying door of the tent, the eagle flag of the Eileen family hangs in mid-air in the distance, with soldiers resting briefly beside the flag. They are not nervous, even whispering jokes. Adam was once again released into the mountain forest by himself, causing Waima to complain, but the blue robe was protecting him and he was not worried. This confidence was quickly shattered by howls of sorrow. Tents in the distance were mercilessly overturned, and the soldiers in the sleeping valley were instantly pierced by sharp blades. Someone's attacking the camp. The warning sound came from all around, and the sound of the horn also reminded them. Unlike the marching horn, it was rapid and like a drum. Arrows and meteors slashed a trail through the night sky, hitting the thigh of the valley soldier. Ignoring his mournful cries, the surrounding valley knights raised their steel swords, shouting incessantly in the camp, for Eileen, for Rune City and, for the valley. His own blue robe guard quickly secured his tent. Atis, draped in light armor, lifted his long sword, and remained calm as he looked towards the attacking enemy. Most of the enemies wear leather helmets with horns on their heads, and the entire animal skin is draped behind them. Stone axes and hammers are the weapons most of them use, and a few short warriors hold short daggers in their hands. Damn the Gao Shan clan! Waima shouted from not far away. He raised his sword and faced a clan warrior, struggling to respond to their attack, clearly with a contrast of strength. Upon seeing this, Atis drew his long sword and said in a deep voice, "Knight of Eileen, fight with me." The blue robes around him shouted, "For the valley." They protected Atis's left and right in a layered manner. A short clan warrior blocked the wide sword of the blue robe, lowered his center of gravity, and struck the feet that the blue robe had not noticed with a stone axe. The blue robe was in chaos, and the helmet was thrown several meters away by another axe. Atis's long sword withstood another axe that was about to become a fatal blow, saving the blue robe. With skillful use of the sword body to separate the space from the clan warrior, he vigorously cut across, and his flesh and blood suddenly bloomed in front of Atis. Seeing this, the blue robe no longer cared about his hands and feet. The space instantly opened up, and the training advantage of the guard suddenly became apparent. Most of the soldiers of the High Mountain clan faced the pincer attack of two blue robe systems, and the distance between the soldiers also widened, resulting in many deaths in battle. Atis once again overturned a High Mountain clan, sealing his throat with a sword, and blood shot out like arrows, splattering on his armor. Waima lost her long sword and was using it to resist the attacks of several people around her. Atis took the opportunity to move forward and swept the sword across. She then used Waima's shield to block several knife and axe attacks. Waima smashed the head of the clan with the shield, and Atis jumped up with his sword and thrust towards the lower body of the clan, causing blood to cross several times. The clan soldiers lay dead at their feet. The short dagger ghostly pierced through the gap exposed in the Valley Knight's armor. Ah! His mournful cry echoed through Atis's ears, as the enemy swam in front of him, casting a handful of sand and dust into his eye with his left hand, and the dagger suddenly stabbed his throat. In an instant, Atis thrust himself with his sword, and when he opened his eyes again, the opponent was split in half by himself. His intestines flowed out to the ground like a snake, and the dagger flew out. The whistle sounded among the High Mountain clans, and they began to run towards the distant slopes. But the valley cavalry blocked their way with spears. Charge! Eustace swung his sword forward, and the valley cavalry quickly followed behind. As soon as the warhorses touched the human body of the mountain clan, the flying corpses became a fleeting backdrop in the middle of the night. The attacking mountain clan was almost completely destroyed, and the spears nailed down the remaining clan soldiers who survived under the hooves. Their eyes, throat, and even forehead were mercilessly ravaged by the spears. In Atis's eyes, this scene was as dazzling as it was. "There are many pirates here, Atis." Waima, covered in blood and dust, walked over and retrieved his sword, repairing it to the enemy lying in mourning. "I can see very clearly, Waima." Atis leaned against the hilt of his sword, feeling no sensation of the first murder, his heart calm like a flood. Eustace ran over to apologize, feeling even more remorseful. "We overlooked the mountain road when we arrived, and the scout did not investigate further. This was a basic mistake, Lord Eileen." "I'm sorry," he said. "It's indeed a low-level mistake," Atis muttered to himself, "but this is my army, I have no organization, no command." Atis thought to himself. "It's not your fault, sir." Atis decisively admitted his mistake. The noisy sound of the campfire reappeared, and a soldier remained silent beside the person lying on the ground, silent. The fire baked his face, seeming to be as big as himself. Atis walked up to the dying valley soldier and crouched in front of him, holding his hand in his hand. The soldier's face was torn apart, and his bones were revealed in front of the 7 gods. Atis lightly supported the soldier's chin with his other hand. "I will avenge you, I swear," Atis whispered. The soldiers in the surrounding valley slowly gathered around, and the tired soldiers who sat down also slowly stood up. They gazed at the young Atis in front of them. The curtain of night surrounded the surroundings, and a quiet atmosphere filled the air. Atis stood up, facing the soldiers. "The night sky needed a speaker. In fact, this is my first time killing someone." Atis' face was as calm as water, and his eyes were sad and firm. The soldier looked at him, and Eustace also looked at him seriously. Wyma clenched her fist. "I must behave well," Atis emphasized in his heart. "The first time I saw my brother die, the first time I saw a tragic wound, the first time I ate graying dry bread and military food, and the first time I drank bitter marching water," Atis said forcefully. "This sword is sharp and flashy, just like the proud Eileen chick before." Atis raised his long sword and looked for the book garden www.zhaoshuyuan.com. The long sword was bleeding. "And now it licks the enemy's blood." A voice came from the crowd, it was Wyma, which caused the soldiers to nod in agreement. Atis continued, "When I called my father a bunch of titles, I never knew what guardianship meant or the honor it contained." Atis walked back to the dead soldier. "But now, I understand the meaning behind it." Atis pointed at the dead soldier, "He brought this guardian. Atis raised his long sword and slowly swept over all the soldiers. "It was you who brought it, the countless warriors who sacrificed their lives for glory in the valley. You are the full meaning of valley guarding. The name of the Eileen family's guardian is made of your iron sword and helmet, and the honor of the Eileen family also comes from you." Atis became more and more excited as he waved his long sword. "I, Atis of the Eileen family, swear under the gaze of the new and old gods that I will avenge my brothers who protect the valley, kill the invading enemies, and punish the traitors who break the oath. Whether my brothers are civilians, knights, or nobles, I will not let them go." Some of the soldiers around were surprised to see this scene, and they all knew what it meant to swear in front of the gods. Eustace drew his long sword and shouted loudly, "Atis Erin." Wyma swung his sword vigorously, "Atis." The soldiers in the valley picked up their weapons and pounded their armor one after another. The sound of bang, bang, bang echoed through the night sky in the camp. "Atis. Atis. Atis." His name was rhythmically called out, the trees were solemn in the wind, the leaves were clattering, the bright moon and stars were shining in the night sky, and the gods seemed to be watching. Atis sleepless all night. 7. Longbow Hall Rebellion, 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lord Yuan was not pulled out of the pile of corpses until dawn and sunrise. He let out a faint gasp, his sword was already broken, his helmet was missing a corner, and his breastplate was clearly hit by a heavy hammer, deeply deflated. The famous bronze armor was not worn on him, but on his eldest son Anda, perhaps because he was defeated. The accompanying physician placed Lord Yuan in the command tent, where Atis, Eustace, and the 3 brothers of the Royce family, Anda, Robert, and Wymer, were all present. Anda said regretfully, "The Takayama clan attacked the western camp, damn the pirates besieged my father, they are all covered in heavy armor." After speaking, he looked at Eustace, who did not shy away and bluntly said, "It's the weapons of the Longbow Hall." Robert looked at John's injury and said, "Is there anything serious with my father?" The doctor is neither a bachelor nor a silent sisters, but John brought him from Fushi City. He replied, "The count is okay, but he may be in a coma for a long time." Wyma frowned tightly, he couldn't believe that his resilient father was so weak now. After a moment of silence, Eustace said to the 3 Royces in his account, "Lord Jan is unconscious, and the march must continue. We need a command." Anda looked at Atis, Robert frowned and stared at Eustace, while Wyma still looked at her father. I propose that under the name of Eileen, Atis Eileen should become the commander of the army, said Eustace bluntly, clearly not wanting to talk nonsense. Anda nodded in agreement, without questioning. How did these pirates find Lord Yuen's whereabouts during last night's attack on the camp? It's obvious that they should concentrate their forces to behead him. Robert controlled the scout and sighed. The scout has been discovering that there are high-altitude clans following us, with a population of around 200. Perhaps their observation has provided intelligence. Upon hearing this, Wyma looked at Robert incredulously, her face trembling with anger. Then why didn't you tell us? Lord Yuen stopped it. He believed that the pirates and the Takayama clan belonged to two separate sides, had no connection, and the number was not large. He predicted that the Takayama clan would not dare to attack. Eustace answered for Robert. Robert spread out his hand, expressing helplessness. How could my father be so confident? The Gao Shan clan is a rogue, bandit, and savage who can be bought with just a little military equipment and food. Wyma roared. Atis stabilized Wyma's excited body and said in a low voice, "Calm down, Wyma. If we bribe them like this, the valley won't need to guard against them anymore." He closed his eyes and said helplessly, "The news has been leaked to the pirates by the High Mountain clan. The Longbow Hall must have found our traces and cannot launch a surprise attack." He looked at Eustace, who had originally planned to use the information gap leaked by his young son that Eustace did not know about the rebellion in the Longbow Hall to falsely return to the city and take down the Longbow Hall in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, now what's even more devastating is that when Jaywood finds out the news is exposed, he may give it a desperate blow, and the youngest son of the Hunter family, Harlan, may Atis faced the crowd and whispered, "Last night we sent cavalry to chase after the fleeing pirates. We should be back now." Just as everyone was anxiously searching for the trace of Lord Yan last night, Eustace suggested sending cavalry to follow the pirates' trail. He decisively adopted it. As pirates with heavy armor and good weapons, even those riding fast horses, were extremely slow and had to be captured before they escaped into the mountains. At this moment, the return to camp happened to sound, and Atis walked out of the camp. The cavalry team was carrying more than 10 prisoners, who were stripped naked and bitten by mosquitoes, causing waves of grief. The cavalry plundered the materials of the prisoners, including not only weapons and dry rations, but even the flag of the Hunter family was carried. Atis wondered why the Longbow Hall was so foolish, and why did the pirates carry these unnecessary things with them, which were cumbersome and laborious, and affected the speed, since they had to lead a surprise attack. Eustace's face turned pale, and he stared closely at the flag of the Hunter family. This not only fully confirmed his brother's act of patricide and betrayal, but also completely abandoned the millennium honor of the Hunter family by his brother. "Greedy pirates, you should be sentenced to death." Wyma roared, wielding his sword to get rid of them, but fortunately Robert stopped him from the side. Atis grabbed the back of a prisoner and pulled him closer. The dagger played with between the fingers, gently stroking the frightened cheeks of the prisoners. "I want to know the situation in the castle." The prisoners did not resist and spoke at an extremely fast pace, sorting out all the information they knew. "Interrogate one by one, identify any conflicts between them, and if any mistakes are found, all will be executed." Atis released the captive and struck fiercely with a dagger, instantly reducing the pirate's palm by half. The bloody scene stunned the prisoners, and then they were each dragged away. Atis returned to the tent and asked for a pen and paper from the blue robe. He sat at the long table with a map, pondered for a moment, picked up the pen, wrote a letter, stamped with the seal of the Eileen family, carefully sealed it with wax, and guided the ravens from the cage out. He held the ravens alone and let them fly in the empty space behind the tent. Returning to the tent, he took out another letter and carefully observed, with a faint smile on his face unconsciously. The prisoners provided details of the castle, and they had never seen Jaywood appear in public before. Jaywood remained in his father's bedroom and all instructions were issued through a messenger. The bachelor who served in the Longbow Hall also disappeared, and it is said that he was imprisoned with his young son Harlan. The defense of Longbow Hall still relies mainly on Jaywood's subordinates commanding the coastal defense of the Five-Finger Peninsula, with less than 100 people. The remaining nearly 200 people are pirates hired by him, and these 200 pirates do not include them. They stated that the reason why the army sent to attack Rune City did indeed receive intelligence from the Takayama clan, hoping to use it to kill Yanroys and dampen the fighting spirit of the Valley Army. They brought so much supplies only because of the pirate plundering habit of distributing supplies in this way, and no one wanted to leave their belongings in the castle. Everyone planned to take the last vote and leave at sea. Atis stood in front of the execution platform, and the dozen or so prisoners who gave him valuable information knelt in front, with ropes tied around their necks. "Damn it, you dishonest bastard, the gods won't let you go," curses and begging for mercy kept coming out one after another. Atis had no expression on his face, waved his big hand, and the executioner cut off the rope. The prisoner instantly fell silent, leaving only the tormenting sound of the rope's neck. He stared at the dying prisoner's gradually defocused pupils until they were completely motionless. Atis left behind all the infantry and the Count of Jon, summoning nearly 400 cavalry together. The battle should not be postponed, it must be fought quickly. The whole army is reorganized, set off immediately, the target is Longbow Hall. Atis jumped onto his horse and led the way. Waima and Blue Robe also rode horses to follow. Atis allowed the long wind to freely slap his face, while the blue flag of the Eileen family led the army forward. There are still survivors in the villages and towns they passed by. When they saw the eagle flag of the Eileen family, they finally chose to regroup and welcomed the Valley Army who came to preside over justice on the roadside. Long live Eileen! Many residents of Eileen Valley burst into tears, running around to tell their scattered relatives and friends, gathering the courage to prepare to return to their original homes. Atis walked at the forefront of the team, standing straight. He witnessed the tears of the people in the valley with his own eyes. Some were as thin as a stick, as if their bodies were wrapped in a layer of skin, while others had lost their arms or legs and were in dire straits. The army in the valley fell into silent silence, with bloody facts before them, and the forces of anger and mourning gradually gathered within the army. A sorrowful army will surely win, Atis thought simply. He did not lose his sanity, and the valley cavalry quickly advanced towards the Longbow Hall. The captured pirates had their heads pierced by steel spears in front of their horses, and were led by a row of cavalry to run back and forth around each village they passed by. The residents saw the enemy's fate in turmoil, and praise and grateful tears could be seen on every face. This is Atis's arrangement. The 3 towers of the Longbow Hall are built according to the terrain, and from a distance in the mountains, it seems that the open longbow is aimed at the Five-Finger Peninsula and the narrow sea across the shore. The favorable terrain of the hillside makes it a model castle that is easy to defend but difficult to attack, and it is also an important reliance for the ancient Junta family to stand firm for thousands of years. Atis personally felt this. The castle stands majestically on the distant hillside, with 2 towers near the foot of the mountain and complete fortifications. Archers are hidden in the tower, with fire oil and rolling stones hidden within. The flag of the Hunter family floats in the tower, and people gather on it, clearly prepared for defense. Waima took the arrow from Atis's hand, galloped his horse, and quickly shot an arrow at the city tower. The letter written by Atis himself remained in it. The general content is very simple. In short, the story of Jaywood is already clear to Duke Jon Eileen. His inheritance rights have been deposed by the king and him, and Eustace is the current count of the Longbow Hall. At the same time, Atis systematically analyzed Jaywood's situation. There was no alliance with him in the valley, only 100 soldiers and 200 unreliable pirates. It was impossible to resist the impact of the valley army, even though Atis could not subdue him now. With enough time, Duke Eileen had plenty of time to deal with him. Jaywood's original plan to keep it a secret had already been leaked, and the loyal courtiers of the Longbow Hall had already spread this matter throughout the valley. Jaywood's thoughts were already well known to everyone. So he had only 3 ways out, 1 way down, and then he was killed by Atis. 2. Apologize for suicide. 3. Escaped from Westeros and went into exile on the continent of Essos. Atis said that through his careful analysis, only the 3rd path is most advantageous for Jaywood, but to maintain the honor of the valley, he advised him not to flee. However, as Atis was about to wait for his response, the city gate suddenly slowly opened. Anda and Robert looked at each other, while Eustace anxiously grabbed the hair of his warhorse, unsure of what his brother was going to do. Weimer even raised a crossbow and aimed it at the city gate. When the city gate was completely opened, Atis's gaze immediately caught a large area of blood that had accumulated and solidified behind the gate, appearing dark red and terrifying. A person with blood stains on their face and messy hair, dragging their body slowly towards them. Harlan. Brother. How could that be? Eustace recognized the visitor and looked at the scene in shock. And the body dragged by Harlan, the young son who received a secret message requesting justice, was actually the patricide Jaywood. Everyone lowered their guard when they saw no one behind him. Eustace excitedly rushed over and quickly dismounted, holding Harlan to his chest no matter how dirty and messy his clothes were at the moment. What's going on, Harlan? He asked anxiously, looking painfully at Jaywood's body behind Harlan. Harlan almost fainted and weakly said, the pirates divided the spoils unevenly, and there was internal strife and fighting against each other. I took the opportunity to escape and, together with my loyal retainers, killed Hunter. Eustace accepted everything with disbelief, and Anda frowned at the scene. Robert once again reluctantly spread his hand and said, "What's this? The grudges of these past few days have not ended yet." Wyma lowered her head and wiped the dragon crystal dagger, curling her lips in confusion. Atis rode forward and looked down at Harlan Hunter. He saw the latter's face turn pale, as if he had been tormented by all kinds of things. He could even see lice in his hair. His beard was long and messy, and his young and handsome figure could still be seen. "Harren, you are the hero of the valley," Atis exclaimed. He did not dismount because he noticed that Harren's wrist was fair and smooth, without any trace, and also without any trace was his neck. Upon seeing Atis, Harlan quickly knelt in front of the horse and said, "Lord Eileen, the Hunter family has caused you shame. I'm really sorry, I. He wept bitterly, tears mixed with the blood stains on his face, making Harlan's entire face even more wet and dirty. Hangtae is a family that has produced many heroes, and now you have proven this point. I hope you can help your brother well." Harren's eyes flashed with a glimmer of gratitude as he bowed down and said, "Hangtae is determined to protect Eileen to the death." Eustace wiped away his tears. His hair, which was covered in hair, was particularly glaring in the sunlight. Atis refused to look straight at him. He turned his horse's head and saw the tired cavalry. He turned to Eustace and said, "Don't you entertain us. Count Eustace." Eustace realized that he needed to perform guest etiquette, so he quickly pulled Harren up and organized his men to enter the city. Atis looked towards the azure sky, but a sea breeze blew in his ear, gradually calming his heart. He followed Harren and said to him, "Ride on the same horse as me, Harren." Eustace looked at him with some confusion, but when Atis insisted, he stopped paying attention. Harlan stood still, feeling a little uneasy. "Lord Eileen, I'm too dirty on me, I'm afraid I might dirty you." Atis immediately interrupted, "No need, I'm already dirty." Wyma couldn't help but laugh when he heard it. He urged, "Hurry up, Harlan Hunter, I've never ridden the same horse as him before, Harlan was hesitating, but Atis picked up the horse with one hand and protected him in front of him, as if he was carrying a child. Entering the city gate, he found many soldiers gathered on the tower, with charred corpses scattered on the side. So many loyal retainers to Hunter? Atis asked. Harlan felt as if the tip of the knife was pressing against his waist, nervous to the point where sweat was pouring down. Atis, oh, I mean, Lord Eileen, most of the soldiers are just grass on the wall. When the leader Juwood died, he surrendered to Hunter. Atis smiled even more and said, I see. He noticed the soldiers in the city tower who hurriedly put away their crossbows. As soon as the cavalry in the valley behind them entered, they found many people staring down at them, all raising their shields. Eustace shouted angrily, "What are you doing? Get out of here." The soldiers clearly focused their attention on Harlan, who was held by Atis with both hands. Seeing Harlan nod slightly, they withdrew their gaze and went downstairs one by one. Atis turned his head and looked seriously at Wyma, calmly staring at her. Upon seeing this, Wyma paused and immediately turned his horse's head, patting the shields of the Valley cavalry one after another with his sword hilt. The Valley cavalry moved quickly and divided into two teams. One team dismounted and grabbed the stairs leading to the city tower with a shield, while the other team picked up crossbows from the back with a round shield standing on the back, wary of the stronghold where the vertical horse stood at the bottom of the tower. Eustace hadn't noticed anything was amiss yet, and he shouted in front of him to have the cook prepare a sumptuous dinner, reaching out to invite the attendants to come and lead the horses. Harlan looked around and realized something was wrong. He forced himself to remain calm and said, "Young Master Eileen, your subordinate." "Guest etiquette, Harlan Hunter," Atis said to himself, "I won't act recklessly in someone else's castle. Your brother is an earl, he is the master, I am a guest, abide by it, it is the last line." Erin seemed to understand everything, he lowered his head and looked at the long sword around Atis's waist. "Don't do anything foolish, Harlan. This is the final advice," murmured Atis. Harlan fell completely silent upon hearing it. "Tell your people to lay down their weapons. I am the eldest son of Duke Eileen, and I will ensure your and their safety. After all, your brother Juwood has died, hasn't he? Why be nervous about the people in the valley?" Upon hearing this, Harlan seemed to grab the life-saving straw of language and said, "Yes, sir. The Eileen family values honor the most." Atis smiled lightly and said, "Of course, above glory, everything is for the valley, everything is for the 7 kingdoms." He continued to threaten Erin, and they dismounted together. Atis gave a glance, and the blue robe quickly surrounded Erin to ensure that he would not leave him half a step. Erin remembered what he wanted to do. "Everyone, put your weapons with the blacksmith." Erin shouted loudly around him. Eustace looked around inexplicably and instantly felt the tense atmosphere. "What's going on, Lord Erin?" He strode closer and asked Atis. "Everything is for the valley, Eustace." Atis raised his hand to signal his composure. After seeing that the soldiers on the castle tower had basically walked down, the castle was replaced by Rune City soldiers stations everywhere. He then explained, "It's not that I don't trust the Hunter family, it's just that it's unclear how many hidden traitors there are among them." Eustace squinted his eyes slightly, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes opening up his dry skin. He didn't say anything, but silently walked into the main hall. "Take it down," Atis ordered. Upon hearing the sound, Blue Robe quickly drew his sword and punched Harlan's face with his protective hand. The blood stains on his face immediately worsened and he fainted to the ground. For a moment, the soldiers of the Hunter family were in chaos, constantly scolding and yelling, but suddenly fell silent and obediently closed their mouths under the steel sword shield of the Valley cavalry. Eustace rushed out of the main hall and said, "What are you doing, Atis? I thought you knew, Eustace." Atis faced the angry Eustace in a deep voice. "You're violating guest etiquette," said Eustace angrily. "No, Eustace, we haven't enjoyed your bread and salt yet," Atis said calmly. "Since you're so excited and suspicious of my actions, why don't you investigate why I did it?" Eustace drew his long sword and said, the knights of the hunter family. There was a commotion among the valley cavalry upon hearing this. 200 more cavalry belonged to the hunter family, Atis calmly analyzed. Wyma angrily rebuked Eustace. Listen to Atis finish, and then the crossbow aimed at him. Harlan is the patricide, Atis said. Eustace was momentarily stunned upon hearing this. He shook his head and grimaced, Eileen. Don't talk nonsense. If the Virgin Mary of the Seven Gods is merciful enough, what I am saying is false. Unfortunately, the gods have never shown mercy to humanity, and that is the truth, Eustace. Atis stood in the distance and loudly said, Harlan killed the old Earl of Hunter, killed Sir Geowood Hunter. He pretended to spread a message in an attempt to distort the truth. He fabricated a story of a hero escaping from prison, and used corpses to lure us into the city. These were all to kill us, and more importantly, to kill you, Eustace. Of course, he also wanted to take this opportunity to get rid of me. He could complain to the outside world that the heir of the valley died heroically in battle with pirates and the Jaywood rebels, preserving the honor of the valley in Eileen. At this time, my father, including all those who knew, thought Harlan was still in prison. The valley cavalry once again had a commotion, looking in surprise, Atis, including Weimer, Anda, and Robert. You're dead, he's the only young son left in the Hunter family, and the title of Earl of Longbow Hall belongs to him. Atis showed no mercy and directly told Eustace the truth he had observed. In fact, Harlan's plan was seamless, but the wrist of a person who had been imprisoned for a long time should not have no traces of being bound, and the soldiers in the castle should not have all aimed at the crossbow when his allies arrived. These were all speculations. At the beginning, Atis continued. Unfortunately, the soldiers here are too obedient to their masters, it's too obvious. If they were loyal ministers, they wouldn't aim their bows and arrows at you when you entered the castle, until they saw Harlan riding with me before retracting them. How suspicious this is. Every word of Atis seemed to strike Eustace's heart like a heavy hammer, and his face turned deathly grey, with a gloomy expression climbing up his face. Harlan has only done one wrong thing so far, Atis joked as he put his hand on the saddle. He didn't ride a horse to open the city gate for us, so I might feel embarrassed to ask him to ride on the same horse as me. Atis breathed a sigh of relief, or maybe I don't have the courage to lead troops into the castle and catch them all. You have no evidence, Atis. Eustace spoke weakly, stabilizing his feet and trying to straighten his waist and abdomen, but he dared not look directly into Atis' eyes. The evidence is easy to obtain, you know what to do, Eustace. Atis knew he had gradually become convinced, and the blue robe held down a hunter knight with a sword on his neck. The knight looked at Eustace's lonely figure, unwilling to speak. We need to add some extra material. Atis's stern tone seemed to never put pity in his mind. The blue robe instantly understood, and the dagger cut through the knight's brow. Your eyes are big and round, sir. The knight could no longer suppress his fear. Yes. Yes. Sir Eustace, what Lord Eileen said is true, but I didn't mean it, I was forced. Eustace strode forward and swung his sword, his voice instantly ceasing. A head fell at the foot of the blue robe. He looked up deeply at Atis and said, I have never seen the Eileen family act like this. Atis's mouth gradually opened, and a soft smile overflowed from his mouth. Forgive me for being rude, sir. You should only have seen 3 legitimate heirs of Eileen at most. A chill rushed from behind Atis, and in the moment Weimer turned around, he saw this terrifying scene. Jewwood's body suddenly twisted and stood up, with a shiny dagger tightly held in his hand. Jewwood leapt forward, and the valley knight behind Atis felt a black shadow flashing on his head, still stunned. Atis. Weimer was about to shoot an arrow, but unfortunately it was too late. Atis turned around, and the sharp wind of the dagger had already scratched into his pupils, causing a momentary itch. The tip of the dagger had touched his throat, and he felt blood crawling onto his skin. The suffocation felt instantly, and he naturally leaned back. Almost at the same moment, a dark shadow emerged from the bag on Weimer's warhorse, and the sound of several sharp claws tearing through the bones appeared in the air. When Atis opened his eyes again, the sky seemed to hang upside down above him, his head dizzy. A warm tongue licked his cheek, and Atis looked up to find himself lying on the ground. Adam, the bobcat, obediently stayed on his chest, his cute head twisted and twisted, as if seeking praise. "Adam, you saved my life." "That's good, child." Atis hugged Adam and gave him a kiss on the cheek. When he looked again, Jaywood's bones turned into a ball of flesh and mud. A person crawled out of it, bleeding profusely. "I'm sorry," he stumbled free from the flesh and crawled towards Atis. In an instant, crossbows and arrows shot from multiple directions, and the assassin turned into a hedgehog. "I'm sorry I didn't kill you." He closed his eyes and shed tears. Queer's regrettable guest said Enda in shock at JaoSuyuan.com. Queer sent someone to assassinate the heir of the valley. Does he want to declare war on the Seven Kingdoms? Who wants to kill me? The first thing Atis thought about was this. He got up and walked towards Heron, who had fainted. He wanted to clarify for a moment, was Heron trying to kill me? Isn't he trying to kill Eustace? He doesn't want to kill me, so who made him kill me? Who is it? Who is it? Harlan lifted his head and smiled at him, as if he had been holding something in his mouth. Suddenly, he retched, and the purple-black color filled his face like a toxin, suffocating him. No. Atis quickly ran over, but it was too late and Harlan had already lost his breath. Atis stared silently at the corpses on the ground, his ears buzzing as if they were blocked by something, and he didn't pay any attention to the crowd around him. You haven't received the judgment of the valley yet, patricide. Atis weakly turned around and left, wanting to escape the castle. Who pushed him to Longbow Hall? Father. If my father had decided to let at most Jon lead his army to come, he could not have distrusted Nestor. Duke Jon Eileen valued his abilities more than anyone else, and he trusted so many people. He trusted Lady Lisa so much, Blackfish also trusted him, and he even trusted his little finger. Atis seemed to remember something, he lifted his head and stopped at the castle gate. When I die, in fact, there aren't many people who can benefit from it. Lisa is a fool, she doesn't have the thought or courage. Robin is only 4 years old. Who is that? Atis looked at the huge castle gate and said, there are only ambitious and conspirators left. He turned around and headed to the main hall. 8. The Aftermath of the Rebellion. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The wealthy knights of the Five-Finger Peninsula gathered on the coast, with surging waves crashing against the deep black reefs. Pirate sails were raised in a disheveled manner in the distance, and the cold sea breeze made pirate ships tremble in waves. Lord Atis has a clever plan. Robert rode his horse leisurely. Dozens of knights behind them stared intently into the distance, with only a few hired knights and mercenaries lying on the ground searching for the bodies of pirates hanging on the shore, trying to find some valuable items. Waima looked contemptuously at the guy lying on the ground without any honor and snorted coldly. A skinny mercenary kept bending down to search, and when he heard the commotion, he looked up and said, "It seems that some knights despise us dirty people." He had a face as thin as a hungry wolf. Waima looked down at him with a stern expression and said, "True knights never plunder the belongings of the dead." "Oh ha, it seems that the knight doesn't want to earn the honor of a knight from these dead people," the mercenary sneered. Waima frowned in confusion, what does that mean? The mercenary found a silver bracelet, blew it lightly with his mouth, and wiped away the fine sand on it with his gloves. He stood up straight and smiled, the lowly mercenary takes wealth from the enemy to make a living, and the noble knight takes honor from the enemy to establish a great name. Seeing Waima's disdainful gaze, the mercenary continued with a smile, "We are essentially the same, sir. If I were born into the same castle and family as you, I would ride a tall horse and wear the stinky face of, I am the best in the world, to enjoy the sea breeze by the seaside. This made the knight next to him laugh, and Wyma blushed. He found that his brother Robert laughed the hardest. Just as everyone was laughing loudly, flags were raised on the distant sea level. The largest flag was Eileen's Blue Moon Eagle flag, while the surrounding stars were flying like the moon with the flag of the Grafson family's burning tower. On a fiery red background, a yellow burning tower stood on a black triangle. The reinforcements from Seagull Town. Wyma whispered softly. The pirate ship gradually sank to the bottom of the sea, without hearing any pre-death roar, only the endless sound of waves. When I brought my brothers to this valley, many residents said that their young master Atis had a pair of eagle eyes and could detect everyone's sins, without exception. The mercenary walked up to the side of the Weimar warhorse and looked at the sinking pirate ship in the distance. Robert's voice echoed leisurely behind him, yes, it would be even more shocking if you were present at the Longbow Hall. Atis's eyes seemed to be able to see through all lies and truths. Ha, sir. The story of the Longbow Hall has already spread throughout the 7 countries, at least throughout the valleys. The mercenary laughed. Wyma remained silent. He knew from a young age that Atis had good facial features and could always detect subtle changes around him, except for the assassination of the unfortunate guest. It's difficult for big ships to dock on the Five-Finger Peninsula, so Seagull Town may only be able to send a few people ashore, Wyma said to her brother Robert. Robert nodded and said that it had been over half a month since he obeyed Atis's command in the Longbow Hall, led his troops to join forces with the scouts of the Five-Finger Peninsula to sweep away the pirates who had come ashore. When he arrived with Wyma, the boy kept wondering why the pirates had escaped and had to go ashore. It wasn't until he heard of a sea battle between a valley fleet and pirate ships in the distance that he suddenly realized. Due to casualties, the Valley Fleet did not attempt to attack the experienced pirate group head-on, but instead blocked the complex Strait of the Wuji Peninsula to prevent the pirates from escaping. The pirates, in search of an opportunity to escape, had to return to the Five-Finger Peninsula once again. They were caught by the cavalry regiment brought by Robert and fought for many days, leaving only a small boat. They had no choice but to set sail again, and the sunken ship in the distance was their fate. It's time to finish work, brothers. The next thing is not our responsibility. Robert elegantly turned his horse's head and left slowly. Wyma looked at the mercenary beside her and said, "Hey, what's your name?" "Just call me Bologna, sir." The mercenary sheathed his sword and turned to join his mercenary brothers. In the interior of the Five-Finger Peninsula, in the tower bedroom of the Longbow Hall, Atis held a book and had candy in his mouth. He was reading the story of the legendary knight, Tall Duncan. He remembered that 2 weeks ago, Sir John Royce, who was unconscious, rushed to the Longbow Hall without stopping when he woke up. When he didn't understand what was going on, he was pulled into the main hall to enjoy Eustace's dinner. When he understood what had happened, he felt ashamed and said to Atis, "You shouldn't be my servant, I'm not worthy to be your knight." That night, he conferred Atis the title of knight. Atis guarded the only 7 gods temple in the Longbow Hall and was anointed with holy oil by the monks in the name of the 7 gods, which was much more dignified than Sir Duncan in history. After that night, Atis could finally call himself a knight. Atis stood up and walked to the window, looking into the distance through the crystal-clear glass. Although the Longbow Hall was close to the narrow sea, he couldn't see it. Atis couldn't help but feel disappointed with the only large castle in this area and even the Five-Finger Peninsula. The maid walked in against the darkness of the room, and a burning candle was placed by the bedside. "Sir, your wine." The maid's plain veil reflected her beautiful face and figure, and her bright eyes attracted Atis. Atis stopped to admire and politely took the glass. "Miss, your beauty adds a unique color to this night, like the shining stars over there." The maid lowered her head shyly upon hearing this. After the maid left, Atis pushed open the iron window and handed the wine glass to the air. A black shadow quickly hung down from the air and licked the wine in the glass. Atis saw the situation and just drank it all in one gulp. He was not idle, but once again used his ability to write letters. He was preparing to write a letter to Robert of the King's Landing and his father at the same time. Atis could not ignore his suspicions and doubts. If it weren't for the lynx Adam, and if it weren't for the unfortunate guest of Querces, but the faceless one of Bravos, he would probably have died here long ago. But he cannot openly say who he doubts, he is just insinuating. He felt a meticulous and malicious plan presented to him, from pirates landing on the Five-Finger Peninsula and breaking into the Eileen Valley, to Harlan sending a fake secret letter to frame Nestor Royce and hook his father, and then stepping into the Bow Hall and being assassinated. Everything seemed to be logical and interconnected. The most concerning aspect for Atis was who advised the Prime Minister at the throne and, in the name of his eldest son, allowed Atis to follow Bronze Moon on the expedition. Littlefinger, is that you? Atis didn't expect anyone else to have the ability to do so, but Littlefinger wasn't Lady Lisa. He was very aware that Lady Lisa's pillow style had a significant impact on his father. My father stayed at King's Landing for a long time, and his understanding of Atis's abilities and the opinions of the Valley Lords towards Atis mainly came from the contents of his letters with Jon and the nobles. Perhaps he wanted to follow Jon on the expedition for training reasons. Although this reason is simple, it is actually very important and effective. Generally, in the process of two battles, unless it involves a core conflict like a life-and-death battle, in most cases, if you capture or encounter the opponent's heir on the battlefield, you will still be lenient. And for the great nobles of Westeros, the tradition of military nobility is deeply rooted everywhere, whether it is the northern region of ancient cultural beliefs, the central plains of the Andar people, or the dawn of the descendants of the Lorraines. The training of inheritors in commanding the army and killing enemies on the battlefield is particularly important, especially for the older generation who have just ended the Robert Uprising War, and their children's military education cannot be left behind. If it were not for this consideration, Atis would not have been sent to Lord Jan as his attendant, and perhaps he would have been sent to Seagull Town as Count Gerard Grafson's attendant. At this time, the Longbow Hall gathered many mercenaries and wealthy knights who had heard the news, hoping to gain money, reputation, and even honor from the war to quell piracy and banditry in the valley. As a result, the brothels outside the castle were particularly prosperous, and the newly appointed Count of Eustace also hoped to expand his family's reputation. He opened the castle's warehouse and entertained knights for several consecutive weeks, spreading the generous Eustace name in the mercenary world. The area from the main hall of the castle to the schoolyard was crowded and noisy. Fortunately, the tower where Atis was located was specially prepared by Eustace for him to live in. It was quiet and comfortable, which reminded him of the scene when he spent his childhood in Eagle's Nest. The castle was grand in scale, with only a few noble attendants and women, and the rest were highly disciplined canyon knights and the guards of Eagle's Nest. When these knights talked, they were often quiet and steady. What was louder than human voices in the castle was the terrifying wind, and what was more attractive than human voices was the sound of water from the Tears Falls of Alicia. Atis rarely leaves Eagle's Nest City. When he was a child, he was the farthest away from home and had not yet reached the Blood Gate. He only arrived at the dangerous rock fortress closest to the Blood Gate after leaving Eagle's Nest City. My father said that the Blood Gate Knight had truly mastered Eagle's Nest City, but in the eyes of Atis, who was a child, he had to pass at least 3 more levels to reach Eagle's Nest City. At each pass, there was a castle that could never be opened. Cliff Castle, Snow Mountain Castle, and Long Sky Castle. A steep and exposed sheep intestines path connected the 3 castles. The saying that no one can break through the Blood Gate also applies to the 3 castles mentioned above. The letter he had secretly spread in the military camp was sent to Seagull Town, requesting the Seagull Town fleet to blockade the Five-Finger Peninsula and prevent pirates from escaping. And just after he had a new idea, Atis took advantage of the news that he had been assassinated by the Queer's assassin and angrily wrote another letter, pointing out that Harlan Hunter had colluded with queers and betrayed the Seven Kingdoms. According to reliable sources, these spies had been involved in the customs and finance of Seagull Town for many years and had a serious infiltration. He demanded that Seagull Town immediately replace a group of customs officials, and in the name of Prime Minister Jon Eileen, he attached a list of trustworthy personnel to the book garden www.zhaozuiyuan.com. Although the customs and finance of Seagull Town were under the jurisdiction of the Chancellor of the Exchequer of King's Landing, it came from the Prime Minister's command. It can be executed directly. My father was also very cooperative. The Prime Minister's order was quickly sent over, but at the same time, he expressed his doubts to Atis through a letter. Although Atis did not directly point out the accusation of being a Querce's spy at the customs, the Chancellor of the Exchequer could at least be accused of dereliction of duty. Atis did not respond to my father in the letter, but would personally go to King's Landing to point out his doubts, including his suspicion of the little finger. For many years, the nobles who had been very dissatisfied with Littlefinger's unauthorized crossing of the valley finally saw this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and wrote to the Emperor, demanding a thorough investigation of Littlefinger. At first, Robert was furious, but under the Prime Minister's advice, he calmed down and dismissed Littlefinger from his position as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Jon Eileen was appointed as Chancellor of the Exchequer, which was considered an explanation to the valley. At this moment, Atis couldn't help but blame his father. His little finger had always been regarded as his own, and he truly regretted not being in King's Landing and not being able to apply the art of language to King Robert. It would be best if Robert had chopped off his little finger in excitement. Now he knew he had no chance of it. Robert, who regarded money as dirt, would surely miss Littlefinger again. The customs revenue in Seagull Town was also not as good as before, and the decline of the national treasury would definitely bring Littlefinger back to the Imperial Council. This analysis is regrettable for Atis. Of course, at present, Junlin has not regarded this matter as an urgent matter to be dealt with. Robert sent a diplomatic envoy to question queers on the other side, and the diplomatic issues between the two countries have become the most noteworthy issue for the 7 countries at present. Although Atis was the cause of the event, he was not in the vortex of the event and stayed peacefully in the valley, pondering his own future. 9. A Farewell Strategy. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the year 296 of the Aegean calendar, which coincided with the celebration of Prince Joffrey's 10th birthday, a martial arts competition named after Joffrey was held as scheduled in the city of King Robert. Atis wanted to take this opportunity to go to King's Landing and express his doubts to his father in person. Even at night, the other side of the castle is brightly lit in the Longbow Hall. Robert led his cavalry into the city, watching the noisy and joyful crowd. Many night tents were haphazardly set up in the school grounds of the castle. This Lord Hunter doesn't seem to have much experience entertaining scumbags and knights, said mercenary Boron, whistling and riding a high horse. He felt very happy in his heart, and Robert Royce, who kept his promise, paid him a commission, which was very generous. On the way back from the Five-Finger Peninsula to the Longbow Hall, he even played the harp, singing and laughing. Waima didn't expect this seemingly messy mercenary to be able to do the job of a minstrel. "My good Jazz, there are so many things you don't know," said Pollen, pulling his tone and getting closer to Weimer's face. Robert greatly appreciated the mercenary. He laughed and said, "Wilma, don't let him laugh. You also play a song." He used his sword as his baton and swayed in front of Wilma, with some kind of brother's joke and encouragement hidden in his words. "Come on, Wilma, you play us and sing." Weima's face turned red like a ripe apple, and he didn't know how to refuse other people's jokes. He grabbed Bologna's harp and lightly stroked it, causing the valley knights and surrounding mercenaries to cheer and curse, blending together. "Well done, Jazz." "What the hell are you doing, Jazz?" Waima continued to play angrily, but these damn mercenaries remained out of tune and couldn't keep up with the rhythm. Unexpectedly, it was Bologna who helped him break free. Don't tease this jazz, let's sing The Bear and the Pretty Girl. Finally, Weimer returned to his familiar tune. The harp sang and danced happily on the road, the valley knight clapped his shield to beat the rhythm, and the mercenaries sang loudly. Bologna's hoarse and unpleasant voice was particularly pleasant to Weimer's ears at this moment. The joyful songs along the way cannot cover the chaotic noise of the Longbow Hall. The raven in the Longbow Hall is unclaimed. The scholar who originally served the Hunter family died in the dungeon, and the new scholar has not yet taken office. Atis has already self-taught raven studies, but has never gone to King's Landing to claim and make a necklace. He took over the raven, and during this period, he helped Eustace exchange letters with the valley lords, kings, and even the school city. After Eustace received a letter from his father and the appointment of counts in the names of Robert and Jon Eileen, his previous dissatisfaction with Atis gradually disappeared after he took full control of the Longbow Hall and the coastal defense of the Five-Finger Peninsula. He arranged many services for Atis, as evidenced by the piles of books in Atis's room and the changing maids in those days. He sent someone to search inside and outside of Harlan Hunter's room, but did not find any correspondence between him and Littlefinger. Even correspondence between him and Junlin and Seagull Town did not appear. In vain, Atis actually admired Harlan's decisiveness. This guy is not a pig teammate, but rather quite trustworthy. The dagger of Atis never left his body. He used the tip of the dagger to pick up the wax wick of the candle, and the flame burned on the wick. A strange feeling struck Atis's heart. He stared at the flame with both eyes, as if there was a cave in it. The candle burning with the wick wrapped another fire inside. Upon closer inspection, someone was heating up by the fireplace, and his silver long hair was like a waterfall in a valley. Atis frowned and couldn't help but bring his face closer to fire. Ahem. Adam's voice pulled him back to reality, and when he looked again, the flames had already extinguished, leaving only black ash stains and an unpleasant smell on the candle wick. Atis smiled and shook his head. He cleaned the dagger with water, picked up a piece of bread, and stuffed it into his mouth. He didn't like noisy crowds, which he had never experienced before in Rune City and Eagle Nest City. He had never seen so many hired knights wandering around the castle. A few weeks ago, he even noticed that foreign knights and noble maids were messing around in the kitchen, covered in flour and covered in white flowers. Chicken and duck even darted around their bodies, creating a strange scene. Atis recalled. My heart couldn't help but feel a ripple. My father has been very strict with himself in this area since childhood, and he always uses Robert as an example. If Robert hadn't planted in the valley, would Lyanna have harbored resentment towards him? His father said angrily. Maybe so many things wouldn't have happened later, and Lyanna might not have followed Riga. After that, he fell silent. Atis had always thought that Riga had abducted Aunt Lyanna, and he was full of doubts and confusion at that time. Father is never foolish, and now Atis roughly understands the story behind that period of history. Father just won't talk nonsense in front of outsiders. In short, I will arrange a wife with good appearance and character for you in the future. Father swore. Then Atis waited for 16 years. According to Count Jan, his father seemed to be very interested in the small roses of the high court Tyrell family, and even referred to them as brothers when he met Duke Metz Tyrell. At that time, King Robert seemed a bit angry about this matter. But Messi's mother, Alina Redwyn, politely declined the marriage, sometimes causing her father's displeasure. Subsequently, her marriage was put on hold due to numerous government affairs. Atis quickly drank a glass of wine. Why did he suddenly remember these things? Although there was no one around, Atis pretended to cough and relieved his inner discomfort. Adam the bobcat crouched on the table, his big eyes curious as he looked at Atis. He dispelled the distractions in his heart, picked up the book again, remembered the many strangers in the Longbow Hall, and decided to leave as soon as possible. The voice of the blue robe rang outside the door. Sir, the adults of Royce have returned, and Count Eustace has arranged a banquet for them. Atis knew he was going to blend into the chaos of the Longbow Hall. He stood up, straightened his clothes, and walked out of the room. As day approached, Waima felt a warm sensation on his face. He squinted his eyes and woke up to find Adam rubbing his clothes with his paws. He was so scared that he quickly jumped up and said, "Adam." Upon regaining his senses, he realized that Atis was smiling and looking at him. "We should go now, Waima," Atis said, throwing Waima's armor over. "Are you in such a hurry? We just came back. We didn't even have a drink at last night's dinner, this Eustace," Waima muttered, but still got off the bed and put on his armor in an orderly manner. "Hurry up, we still have to hurry." Atis turned around and left. When he arrived at the castle, he found that the chaotic night tents were all gone. Eustace nodded slightly to him and said, "I'll see you off, Atis." Behind him was a fully armed cavalry unit. Atis closed his eyes, and there was no Lord Ewan in the queue. He had already left Longbow Hall with his eldest son Anda a week ago and returned to Rune City. Robert looked at Atis with a serious expression, the flag of the Royce family fluttering in the air, but the blue moon eagle flag of the Eileen family was not seen. When Waima arrived, everyone had been waiting for him for a long time. Robert urged him, and Waima quickly galloped over and stopped by Atis's side. "Have you set off?" Waima asked an unnecessary question, and as soon as he spoke, he secretly resented his foolishness. "We're all waiting for you, you guy," Robert scolded. Then the cavalry slowly walked out of the city gate, and Atis also galloped over. The army was marching in the area closest to the desert in the valley, and the green shade could only be seen in the distant mountains and forests. Waima noticed a significant slowdown in the speed of the army's approach to the mountains and forests. He looked at Atis puzzled and found that he was just calmly looking forward, seemingly not paying attention. Robert kept observing the surroundings and cast his gaze towards the distant sky. Eustace followed closely behind the team, and Waima was puzzled from the beginning why he kept a considerable distance from them with fully armed cavalry, like the relationship between the front and rear armies. Waima shook his head and found himself increasingly puzzled. "Waima, there have been many incidents of rocks breaking and falling in the valley. Do the residents of the mountains and forests approach the falling rocks when they appear calm after they fall?" Atis suddenly asked. Although Waima didn't understand why Atis asked so, he saw many situations described by Atis in Rune City. "Definitely not, maybe the whole cliff will collapse in the next second." "This is just the calm before the storm," Waima confidently replied. "Yes, the crisis seems to have been resolved, but in reality, the most fatal thing lies behind it, such as the regrettable guest after Harlan Hunter." Atis's plain tone left Waima with lingering fear, thinking that Atis should have been frightened by the assassination of the regrettable guest. He comforted and said, "Atis, don't worry, it was all my fault before, I didn't have a good view of you." Waima looked at Atis seriously. Atis smiled at the words, and Robert couldn't bear to watch anymore. He slapped Waima on the head and said, "Hurry up." Waima glared at his brother with displeasure, flicked his whip slightly, wanting to accelerate his pace, but he suddenly slowed down, and the sound of the scout's bugle in the distance suddenly sounded. Robert immediately charged ahead of the army. "The whole army is advancing. Advance. Speed up," and the Valley Knights all quickened their pace, following behind Robert. "What's going on?" Waima realized that the charging flags were all Royce's family flags, and he was also accustomed to obeying military orders and following among the Robert cavalry. Atis picked up the iron gun hanging from his saddle and said, "I will take you to make great achievements and fame." "Waima, how should you thank me?" Waima was about to answer when he suddenly found the flag of the Eileen family falling in front of him, and countless high mountain clans with disheveled hair looked at Robert's charging team in fear. A large army attacked and swept, causing the Gao Shan clan to collapse in an instant. Waima leaned tightly against his horse's back, and his long sword frantically spread and swung on both sides. At least 10 Gao Shan clans had died in his own hands. Blood and flesh fly in the mountains and forests, the green shade dyed with fresh blood, as if luxurious red dye is sprinkled in the natural green, with a freehand brushwork. The head of the high-altitude clan leader was hanging from the spear of Atis, and he rode into the middle of the battlefield. "Your leader is dead, surrender and not kill." After speaking, fierce warriors rushed forward, all killed by steel guns and crossbows. Eustace's cavalry team also instantly occupied the high mountains and forests. They dismounted and held crossbows, shooting deadly arrows at the high-altitude clan who attempted to escape into the mountains and were unable to roar. Waima saw Bolong on the battlefield, entangled with a high mountain clan, wielding a steel sword to cut open the enemy's fragile armor. Blood sprayed from his chest, and he casually shook his hair, also discovering Waima. "You're not bad, find the book garden www.zhaoshuyuan.com sir." Bolong quickly approached and 3 high-altitude clans besieged him. Waima's horse twisted its head and attacked the enemy from the side to cover for Bologna. "You haven't left yet, mercenary. Whoever has money, follow him." Poland killed the last enemy and stabbed his sword into his throat, his tone teasing. Atis swept his steel gun to block the stone axe thrown down, and his blue robe rushed forward, killing the remaining members of the High Mountain clan. He said to Bologna, "Then you should go find the Lannister family. They are the wealthiest, with golden dragons everywhere." Bolong waved his hand helplessly, looking at the chaotic situation in front of him. The obedient surrendered high-altitude clans raised their hands and buried their faces on the ground. "There's no chance, Lord Eileen. I just focus on the present and seize the opportunity," Bolong said with a smile. Atis left satisfied, he liked the sincerity of mercenaries. Waima only learned about all of Atis's plans from Robert. It turned out that Atis had specially arranged a part of cavalry, leading empty carriages to warm up the seats, pulling them with horses, and running to the mountains and forests under the banner of the Eileen family to set up camp. Later, he led light cavalry to follow behind, in order to lure the high-altitude clan, who had 1,000-year-old hatred with the Eileen family, to appear and catch them all in one fell swoop. "Lannis has a debt that must be paid," Atis joked to Waima. Waima learned from Bologna in frustration, searched for the body, and ignored Bologna's strange gaze. Her heart was filled with the distress that Atis did not tell her. "You slept like a dead pig last night." Robert mercilessly exposed it, and everyone laughed again. Atis received the number of deaths, and only a few of the lured cavalry he arranged were alive, while as many as 300 high-altitude clans surrendered with casualties, which was enough to keep them breathing for decades, Atis thought to himself. 10. Go to Junlin again. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Atis returned to the city of Rune, and the Count of Jon had already set up a formation to welcome him from a few miles away. Numerous flags stand in the wilderness, with no end in sight. The flag of the Burning Tower and the flag of the Orange Pebble stand at the forefront, corresponding to the 2 leaders of the Grafson family in Seagull Town and the Royce family in Rune City, who also ride horses and line up in front. Many battle flags are cold in the long wind, and the lords of various valleys in the northern peninsula of Crab Bay are all here. Atis even saw the family flags around Eileen Valley, such as the flags of Shinsu City and Iron Oak City. The leaders or eldest sons of each family even occupied the front rows of the welcoming team, and the practical yet majestic valley-style armor shone in rows, reflecting the sunlight in unison, like a shimmering lake. The solemn will, like that of a deity, was strictly followed by both sides. Atis slowly walked out of the team, and his warhorse calmly raised its head. John Royce dismounted, and many lords and knights also dismounted, with overlapping and consistent movements. In the distance, they could see flowing peaks and whirlwinds. John walked up to Atticus, holding the hilt of his sword and observing the bloodstains on Atticus's lock armor. The valley lacks a hero, Atis, he said softly. There are very few in my sight who can rival you at such a young age. The young inheritors of the valley looked up at Atis with blood in their eyes. Jon turned around and drew his long sword. The lords of the valley. The knights of the valley. The young attendants who want to be great knights. He pointed to Atis. Looking at this young man, he saw through the cunning scheme of the Oathbearer. He eradicated the pirates who invaded our home. Not long ago, he destroyed the most active mountain clan in the Eileen Valley. That damn crazy rat clan. How many young knights in our valley were attacked and killed by them before, and how many young ladies and ladies of the family were abducted and taken away by these barbarians? Ah, the 7 gods are above. I need to remind which sister of yours, is it? Which daughter of yours? John Royce shouted at the young man behind him like a beast. No, the knights shouted in unison. I ask you, who avenged us, who made us famous, who made our valley knights fly over the Mingyue mountains and the giant spear? From then on, no one in the 7 kingdoms knows about the valley eagle. No one in the people knows about the valley knights. Jon passionately waved his long sword, his voice even becoming hoarse, as if the valley was shaken by it. Ats. 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 The voice of the feudal lords in the valley shook like thunder, piercing through the entire mountains and forests. Behind Atis, knights such as Weimer and Robert drew their swords, even including mercenaries. Ats. 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 Adam, the bobcat, was attracted by the sound. It jumped out of the cloth bag hanging by the saddle and onto Atis's left shoulder armor, revealing its sharp teeth. This scene not only did not scare the crowd, but also made more people's eyes even more fanatical. Even Lien Zhanma anxiously gathered and raised his front hooves, and the sound of his nose rushed into the cheers of the crowd, becoming even louder and more shocking. Atis would not waste the opportunity created by Jon for himself. He crouched on his shoulder with a shadow bobcat, flicking the reins around his restless warhorse neck, and slowly walked into the crowd. In the midst of the noisy crowd, the knights consciously made way. Atis walked slowly, his ears filled with the fervent voices of the knights. Returning to the city of Rune, he found that everyone's attitude towards him was less relaxed and humorous than when children came here as attendants, and more silent and awe-inspiring. Atis didn't care, he returned to his own tower. Lord Ewan walked into the room and approached Atis, saying, Prince Joffrey's 10-year-old naming day is coming. At that time, King Robert will hold a sizable martial arts competition. Atis, your knightly talent should appear in front of the 7 kingdoms. Upon hearing this, Atis smiled and said, Lord Jon, are you going too? My son Anda will wear bronze armor to participate in the competition, maybe Robert will also go, and Wyma will definitely follow you, Jon replied. Atis accepted Jon's suggestion, which was originally his own plan. After resting for several days, Atis and the 3 brothers of the Royce family embarked on the road to the city of King's Landing. Junlin City, Imperial Meeting. You can't even gather the damn 20,000 golden dragons. Let's all go to the 7th floor of hell. Robert Baratheon's plump face trembled, his body swayed excitedly, and even the tables and chairs of the imperial meeting were shaking. Jon Eileen frowned slightly and said to Robert, Your Majesty, I don't think it's better. Robert immediately interrupted him, Oh my Jon, the king is in trouble. The Prime Minister is here to help, but you must gather these 20,000 golden dragons for me no matter what. You must have a way. My martial arts competition cannot be so shabby. Stannis rarely attended the imperial meeting. Just as he was about to speak up and advise, Your Majesty. You're doing nothing. Robert patted his ear and said, 7 layers of hell. Nothing. No king's authority or honor. Listen to Stannis, I don't need you to teach me how to be a king. Robert looked at Stannis and said seriously. Most of the silence in the Imperial Council is when no one can come up with an idea, and the rest of the time is when the king and his beloved brother are arguing. Prime Minister, two brothers, if the meeting is so boring, I will leave first, said the Minister of Justice, Lonley Byrashian, who had only recently arrived at King's Landing at the age of 19, lazily lying in a chair. Just as Jon Eileen was about to speak, Robert waved his hand and said, "You brat, nobody listens to you when you come here. Hurry up and find your prostitute." Lonley was not angry at all. He politely looked at the king's hand, Jon Eileen nodded, and only then did he elegantly step on his feet and leave. Wallace smiled obsequiously as usual when he left, and Lonley responded with a smile. The octopus spider finally spoke up and said, "Your Majesty, please allow me to say something." After obtaining Robert's consent, he slowly said, "After my little bird investigation, there are no spies from Queers or the Free Trade City-State in Seagull Town. Hiring regrettable guests may only be the personal act of Heron from the Hunter family. Perhaps many lords in the valley have wronged our poor little finger." Robert's eyes lit up as he heard the words. He looked at Jon Eileen and said, "John, please take care of the valley over there. You can't always let the backyard catch fire." Robert straightened his back and said, "Who is the most skilled in handling the country's finances? Who has the closest connection to the Iron Vault? Who can turn out my damn 20,000 gold dragon for me?" Academician Pazzer said with a trembling voice, "I don't think there might be anyone here who is competent, Lord Barecci." "Oh no, that's not what I meant. The Prime Minister is busy with these arithmetic matters. Lord Wallace guards the security of the kingdom, Lord Stannis." Stannis interrupted coldly, "Don't praise me, Lord Pachel. No one in the Imperial Council can match Littlefinger financially, this is an undeniable fact." The king clapped and said, "That's right. That's settled, John. You need to make up for yourself and leave these troubles to Pettier, so that he can come back and continue to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer." The Prime Minister calmly replied, "If you do this, the feudal lords of the valley." Upon hearing this, Robert immediately left his seat and said, "John, my good lord, you are the guardian of the valley. Show some duke's authority and make the group of people in the valley obey you, letting them know that the eagles in the valley are not easy to deal with." Jon Eileen knew that Robert had made a decision. He respectfully bid farewell to the king, greeted other important officials, and left the Imperial Council. He had a solemn expression, and he didn't want to go anywhere between the Imperial Council and the Prime Minister's tower. He had no strength to fight back against the heavy burden of government affairs and Lisa's nagging. He missed his son a bit, and even became very excited when Robert spoke of the Eagle of the Valley, because from the valley to the King's Landing, the title of Atis had already been passed down to the Seven Kingdoms, from the summer sea to the land of eternal winter, by the wandering bards, mercenaries gathered and scattered in the Longbow Hall, countless ravens released by the Valley Scholar, and many other channels. The excellence of his eldest son inspired him to think of returning home. He planned to stay as Prime Minister for at most another year before leaving Junlin and returning to the Eagle's Nest at zhaoshuyuan.com. A few days later, Atis and his subordinates arrived at King's Landing, and the city remained unchanged, as usual, with a foul odor. The flag of Eileen has attracted countless people's attention. From the valley to the King's Landing, there are many free riders, canyon knights, and knights and attendants from the Hajin land and the King's realm who want to join the team. The name Valley Eagle Atis has really come out, and the villages they pass by, the girls who hope to see the true appearance of the legendary knight and the young boys who yearn for swords are all reluctant to part with the team that has passed away, looking longingly at the Blue Moon Eagle flag. Atis himself did not follow the team. He, along with Weimer and Eileen's personal soldiers, dressed in simple attire and dressed as free riders admiring the Valley Eagles, followed behind the team. Every day, he rested in the knight's tent with Weimer, listening to the singing of the minstrel, and watching the swaying skirts of the village girl. He enjoyed the feeling of lying on a haystack, which had nothing to do with valley hunting or palace politics. It was a simple pleasure. Amidst the hustle and bustle of the city of King's Landing, Atis looked at it with a different perspective. It was truly a beautiful place for free riders, hired knights, and mercenary groups, without the need to see through deadly conspiracies hidden in hidden places, without the need to observe and speculate on everyone's thoughts, free and joyful. Atis tried not to exclude the short lives of free riders and hired knights from his noble status. Waima galloped out from a distance, looking at his excited expression. It seemed that he had found some fun hunting in the woods. Atis fixed his gaze on it, and sure enough, a wild rabbit was caught by Waima and handled very cleanly, with almost no signs of injury or damage to its fur. I killed myself with a thin arrow, Waima threw the dead rabbit over and rode forward alongside Atis.